Chapter 151, Tales of Travel. I had no reason not to follow her, so I kept pace behind her as she walked toward the keep that was under construction. When we arrived, there was already a table and chairs set out for us. Austin wanted nothing to do with the lunch and left me high and dry, saying he had important things to do, making the chair set out for him empty. The bastard. My mind couldn't comprehend why Tracy was acting like she was, and it was looking for some indication of a trick or trap. I feared poison at first, but even that was too underhanded for something she would do. Still, I kept my vigilance up just in case. Sit. Tell me of your travels. How was the surrounding area? Did you come across anything interesting? Tracy started while what appeared to be an aide came to serve us both food. It was a cut of meat from something nearby, I suspected, along with some kind of berry sauce. There were no grains or vegetables, as those were rare to find. Without a reason not to, I went into my story. Our travels were mostly mundane. The forest and plains were mostly free of anything high level, and there weren't that many people to be found. We gathered all who wished to join and pointed the rest in the direction they wanted to go. The only interesting thing we encountered was a dungeon about a week's travel southeast. I explained. There was no reason to hold anything back. We were on a one-way trip through the area, and nothing we came across needed to be kept secret. Oh, a dungeon? Did you go into it? She asked, and I nodded. Fascinating things, really? When I went into the one near here, it was unlike anything I had seen. It kind of reminds me of the fallen pylons, but a little bit more organized. All right, this is getting confusing, and I'm sick of it. She was acting like we were friends having a casual chat, and I couldn't take it anymore. Why did you ask me here? I laid my question bare. Abigail was working on getting me more diplomatic, but I had no hand for it. Blunt and to the point was infinitely better than the dance we were going through that led nowhere. Playing along would be a waste of time. As blunt as always, I see. She laughed. Surprisingly, that is a trait I've come to like. I just stared at her for my unanswered question. Her smile diminished before she answered. What did you expect from me? That I would be mad? Angry over how the tutorial ended? Yes, I answered. She shook her head. I made it out alive, and that was all I wanted. While it would have been nice to get a few more reward points, I think I did pretty well, all things considered. She just looked at the dubious look on my face and sighed. Look, I understand why you did it. You made a decision for you. I'm not angry about it. I would have done the same. Plus, as much as I would like to believe in what I've built since our return. She waved at the walls and keep under construction. I doubt anything has changed with my abilities to defend against you. I don't even think the city lord would make a difference. She made good points, and some of my hesitation faded away. While I didn't know her the best, she didn't seem to be lying. Wait, city lord? You're not the city lord? When I ran into her with a group of bodyguards, I had assumed she was the city lord. Oh God, no, I learned my lesson during the tutorial. I do not want to be the leader any more than I have to. It's better to push that responsibility off on someone else, she said. Tracy then laughed at a thought before explaining. That way, when an ice-clad madman comes knocking, it isn't me they're looking for. I snickered at that, and we both enjoyed the joke. I didn't think you were one to give up control, I commented. Tracy seemed like one who needed to be in charge. That's the best part. Nick wants nothing to do with running the city and only wants to be lord in name only. All he cares about is leveling up, and I still retain all control, but dish off all the responsibility to him. Someone comes to conquer the city, his problem. Another city has a problem with us, his problem, while I get to control everything else. It's a win-win, really, she said while cutting up the food on her plate. Now that seemed more like something she would do. After the conversation got rolling, it was easier to talk about things with her. I wasn't looking for the hidden dagger, and she held a lot of things I wished to know about. What of the pylons since our return? I haven't placed mine, so I still don't know how much has changed. I questioned. That was a major headache. The store isn't as easily available anymore, and buying the things we need is difficult. She pointed at the stones flowing as people carried them by in with her fork. We have to go and haul stone from the area instead of buying it from the store. Everything else is gone as well, no more buying information. No more consumables or treasures. The entire shop is missing and a bare-bones one replaced it, she said. I had feared as much when we realized that was a tutorial-only occurrence, but there was other information about buying goods from other planets. How were we to do that without a shop? What replaced it? I asked. While we knew the shop we once knew wouldn't be a thing, it still had to be an option. We knew buying things from other planets was possible, so it had to have that function at some point. A hassle, that's what. The new shop requires a merchant high enough level to open trade up. Tracy answered, once the pylon is placed, there is no shop tab like before. It only becomes an option once you appoint a merchant for your city. What's available in the shop depends on what level or rarity profession the merchant is. What do you mean you need a merchant? I asked. This was the first I was hearing of this, and while we had a merchant, Jonathan, it would have been nice to know beforehand. She gave me a questioning look before realization flashed on her face. You don't know? Oh, I guess you only would after placing your pylon, so that makes sense. Certain functions of the pylon require an advisor slot with someone with a specific profession before they can function. The shop won't work unless you have an appointed merchant or trader of a certain rank or rarity. The higher level the merchant, the more things you can do. Trade outside the planet is still well out of reach, but pylon-to-pylon trade isn't that far off. An E-ranked merchant should unlock regional trade between pylons in the area. We aren't sure how far the range is, but it should reach any pylons nearby, hopefully. She explained. What, so you can just appoint a merchant and the store opens up? I thought it would be more than that. I questioned. It's a bit more than that, she said. It's similar to appointing a seneschal or mayor. They need to be affiliated with the city and a member of your faction before you can appoint them as a city merchant. Jonathan is already above level 50 in his profession. If he gets a few more levels before we place the pylon, we can start out with trade. My thoughts turned toward how I was going to use that feature and how I could best utilize it. There are other things you can do to increase the range of trade or boost other things, but learning that is slow going. Without the readily available information, we have to find out new things from the people who join us. The tutorials focused on different things, and other people will have different knowledge than us, she said. A few other things changed with the pylon, but nothing as major as the shop. The pylon levels are similar from what I can tell. We are still only at the town level, but it was the same as before. We sat and talked about a few other things over the meal, but none were as important. She talked about her time since returning while I talked about mine. After hearing about a possible pylon in the city I had left, she questioned to know more about that. I told her what I knew, but that was likely outdated by now. It had been a while since we left, and the whole conflict could be resolved by the two factions by now. The points that I picked up from her that stood out were the struggles at the beginning. They had placed the pylon, but they had nothing to build with. They needed people to gather resources, but they had nothing to pay them with. Everyone had just returned, and no one had any money. People chipped in when they could, but that ran out quickly after the bare necessities were met. No one wanted to work for free, and we had nothing to pay them with, she explained. Nick went into the dungeon a few times by then, and I could offer something, but no one knew what a copper coin was worth. We didn't get people up and working until we started taxing the dungeon exit and the coins started steadily coming in. But even then, we paid people mostly in food or materials. It was how I had expected the start to go when I founded my city. I planned to have a bit of a treasury when we finally arrived at our destination, but that wouldn't last forever. The one good thing about taking time to travel and visit other cities was learning how much things were worth. Now, that would change with supply, but the general worth of a coin would be set by the time we started dealing with it. People would know how much being paid a coin or two was worth. It was as we were wrapping up our meal, and I was about to depart, that Tracy said something that surprised me. I know you prefer honesty, and I don't want you to confuse my intentions. Her start made me curious to where she was going. The tutorial was the tutorial. That's the past, and I don't want there to be any bad blood between us. I intended to establish relations between us during this meal, and I hoped it worked. I have no doubt your city will do well, and I want us to start diplomacy off on the right foot. She knew I preferred directness, but I hadn't expected her to just come out and say that. She did a good job of changing my opinion of her by freely giving my information on how the pylon changed and her initial struggles, and I hadn't looked deeper at her intentions in doing so at the time. I should have expected her to have an angle. She always had an angle. At least this time it wasn't one I would be mad at. Trying to build good relations wasn't that bad of an idea, and I saw no reason to refuse. The world reset, and starting our clean slate with an enemy was not what I wanted to do, and she wasn't that bad of a person. Chronically selfish and mostly looking out for herself. Sure, but not the worst person in the world. I see no reason to refuse, but we will be quite a distance apart. I don't plan on stopping anytime soon. I was being truthful when I said we were only here to resupply before we continued our journey. I mentioned, "Oh, I know, but you can never have too many friends. And you seem like the kind of person who makes a good friend," she said with a small smile. "I can help you get some things you probably wouldn't have been able to, but I can't just give it to you for free. We still have a lot of people to feed and all, but I can make it a touch easier." "I appreciate that. We have some coins from the dungeon we hit on our way here. I do not need, or wish for, charity," I said firmly. It was partly because we didn't need anything from the city. We had everything covered in terms of base necessities, but it was also not to be in anyone's debt. Similar to starting this fresh slate with an enemy, owing someone a favor was probably worse, especially for something as little as some free goods. By the way, I expect some of our group to stay after we move on. Not everyone is cut out for travel, and we already lost quite a few. The first day after leaving the city, nearly 10 people changed their minds and left. I mentioned, "Duly noted. How long do you plan on staying before moving on?" Tracy asked. I considered for a moment. "Not long. A day or two at most, probably less." "Well, enjoy what little we have to offer. Nick has the dungeon on lockdown currently, but other than that you can do anything," Tracy said. That seemed a touch odd, but I said nothing of it. The whole experience went better than I thought it would, and I was happy to be leaving in good spirits rather than what it could have been. We were now free to resupply and get on our way without any other problems coming up. We were barely a month into our trip and were still a long ways away. Chapter 152, The Herd. We didn't spend much time in the city and were on the road again in a day. Tracy helped us get everything we needed, and even some things we didn't know were available. It put a dent in our newly acquired coins, but it was well worth it in my opinion. It was mostly food, but there were other things filtered in. Raw materials we weren't able to get a lot of from the dungeon, or what the dungeon didn't give out. Cloth mostly, as the dungeon seemed to have an aversion to the stuff. Ripped clothes or new items needed it, and picking some up now was helpful. One thing that did surprise me that snuck in was a skill shard. Skill shards bought through the pylon before had to be learned by the person who bought them. These were different. The little crystal shards could be used by anyone, and there were no restrictions on who could use it. The skill we received wasn't very good, but just the appearance of it was nice to have. It was a generic bow skill called Precision Shot that I had no use for, but someone else would. I thought of giving it to Sarah if she didn't already have the skill. Another thing I asked Tracy before we left was if she knew where any beasts of burden were. Horses, donkeys, bulls, or something similar would work wonders for our traveling speed. We weren't very fast on foot, and I wanted to speed things up. Just traveling to the next city took over a month, and at the rate we were going, the trip would take over a year. Not every second was spent on travel, and there were areas we could shave some time down. But I wanted to boost our base speed rather than feel rushed. While we weren't on a specific timeline to get there, neither did I want it to drag out. She let me know of a few places where they were likely to be, but she didn't know for certain. She mostly pointed out where old ranches once stood that had horses or the animals I was looking for. We hit a few of the spots on our way, but sent out Austin and Hal for the ones that were too far out of the way. Evidence of the animals being there previously was clear, but the beasts themselves were gone. Similar to the last ranch we came across, the surrounding area was searched but nothing was found. The tracks were too old for Hal to get anything from, and too much had changed. The disappointment grew the more we came across abandoned ranches, but that all changed a few days out of the city. We were ambling along, pulling our carts, when Austin came sprinting back to the caravan, visibly excited. He came dashing up to me, nearly vibrating, before saying, "Horses! A herd of them out over the plains. At least 50 of them. His words quickly spread through the caravan and we all dropped what we were doing. All right everyone, you know what to do. Braden and the builders, get those posts in the ground. Everyone else, carry the planks in place and secure them tightly. They will be stronger than normal horses now that they have levels. I announced to everyone. We had prepared for when we found animals long before we actually ran into any. The first thing we had to do was construct a pen to corral them into. It would help facilitate the taming process and make the whole thing easier. And someone tell Sarah to get on deck. I added. After we had the herd penned, it would be up to her to calm them down and tame them. She was out with Jonathan whenever the opportunity arose to increase her level, but she was still a touch low for the area we were in. The horses were most likely in the high F rank with a few in the low E rank, and she hadn't even hit level 25 yet. That was the main reason we had to keep the herd contained. It would help her bridge the gap in level and make the process easier, rather than have her chase the herd around while her skills failed to work. Something told me that wouldn't work out. Everyone rushed into motion and posts were slammed into the ground at a rapid pace. The forests were long behind us and it had been grassy hills for most of our travel since we left the city, which made everything easier. While everyone was working to construct the pen, I got more information out of Austin about the herd. How far out are they and what level is the stallion? I asked. A few miles away roaming the plains, and I couldn't get close enough for an identify, see. Based on the creatures in the area, though, I'd put him at the low or mid-60s. He answered. Do they have an affinity yet, or are they still neutral? Was my next question. I couldn't tell from how far away I was. I didn't want to spook them, he said. We would need to change our approach depending on what affinity the horses had, and that was something we needed to know. Some beasts stayed neutral as they evolved and didn't pick up an affinity, while others did, making our plans dependent on which they were. I wasn't well versed enough in monsterology to know why some did and others didn't, but what mattered now was not putting fire affinity horses in a wooden pen they could burn down. Take Gabriel with you and go scout them out. He should be able to determine their affinity. If you spook them, we can just find them again. It's better to know and chase them than guess and be wrong, I ordered. He nodded before scurrying off to find Gabriel among the caravan while I turned to monitor the work going on. After discussing with Austin, some of the people were idling around after their part was over and that needed to be fixed. Anyone who can conjure walls or barricades, start creating a funnel into the pen. Anyone else, start setting up camp. We could be here a while. I shouted out. I went ahead to create long straight sections of ice leading to the gate of the pen, and others with the ability moved to join me. The reason we didn't create the pen out of conjured walls like Jonathan's stone or my ice was that they would fade over time. We had to constantly supply the mana to keep them intact, and the taming process was going to take a long time. Sarah was still new to her class and the horses out-leveled her. It would take a while for her skills to work on one horse, let alone the entire herd. My ice would take a special amount of monitoring due to the heat of summer as well. We were currently experiencing the hottest days of the year, which made standing ice that much harder to keep from melting. I could have done it, but it would have been a headache to keep active for an unknown amount of time. A headache better left for something else that would no doubt arise during the operation. It was easier to cut a few trees down ahead of time and make a pen that way than to constantly monitor a conjured one. Plus, we had a few more builders now and we didn't have to rely on Braden alone anymore. The increased manpower made the construction effort much faster than it would have been, and we were ready to go in a few hours. It was just in time for Austin and Gabriel to come jogging back. They don't seem to have an affinity and the highest level is 64, Gabriel shouted from Austin's back. Even though his legs now extended down past his kneecaps, they were still a few weeks out of being whole. The healers were getting better at regrowing them, and each session resulted in more growth than the last. They were optimistic that they would be as good as new in a few weeks, now that they had gotten past the knee joint. Good. Austin, you go keep an eye on them until we are ready, and Gabriel, go help with the funnel construction. Any extra distance will make this whole thing easier. I looked at both of them, giving them their next tasks. Abigail, I shouted over the sounds of hammers on wood. A bob of brown hair signaled her arrival, and I turned to her as she closed in. I relayed to her the level and affinity before getting an update. Is everyone in place? Yes, they are arrayed out and ready to direct the herd into the pen. Given their level, we might need to condense our lines down so no one gets stampeded over. Single fighters won't be able to do much with a level 64 stallion charging at them, she said. We planned to have Austin and Hal try to lead the animals the best we could, but that could always go wrong. They would be on either side of the herd to guide them, but that wasn't a foolproof plan. The others were to fan out and keep the horses from going in a direction we didn't want them to go, but they could take a full charge if any got away. I would help on the back end, making sure the herd didn't split up while driving them along. We figured if I flared my flashier skills, the horses would run away from me and make it easier to guide them in the direction we wanted them to go. All we could hope was they didn't develop some unknown skill that would ruin our whole plan. The only person who wouldn't be joining in the corralling effort was Jonathan. His job was to blunt the charge after we got them into the pen with his skills and shields. If the horses came in hot, we weren't sure if the wooden posts would hold up to their charge. They were built sturdy enough to keep them in, but we weren't sure if they would hold up to a full-speed charge that went straight through. We reinforced the pen and added what skills we could to keep that from happening, but with Jonathan there, we would make double sure. All right, I'll start circling around to come at them from the other side. Everyone is to wait for my signal, I said before jogging away. My unarmored form made it easier to trek through the tall grass, and it would keep me unencumbered in case something went wrong. None of us were ranch hands or cowboys, and our experience with this kind of thing was non-existent. And even if we were ranch hands, the animals had changed so much to make that experience not worth as much. Levels and skills changed more than just humanity. It took me a few minutes to get around where the herd was spotted, but I managed to get there without anything tipping them off. Surprisingly enough, I took a wide arc just in case, and it seemed to work out. I lined the angle up as best I could before starting to power up some of my skills. Permafrost flared out first before Desolate Blizzard joined in for the first time. It was the first time I was using the skill other than for training, and it was for corralling horses. Now that I was in range, I could see the herd grazing around in the grass. The group of 50 or so nibbled on what they wanted before moving on to the next patch that looked good. Mana had done them well, as all of them looked like peak specimens, with rippling muscles and flowing manes. Glossy coats filled the herd, and they seemed to be in good health from what I could tell. Even a few foals were running around inside the perimeter. Observing them for a little longer gave time for my skills to start up, and after those two started their work, sweeping snow added in for a bit of a nip. If the horses thought the chilly wind was all, the snow would get them moving in the right direction. I wasn't trying to kill the horses, so I ended things there. Momentum of the avalanche and my other skills were unnecessary for what I was attempting to do. I only wanted to section off a large area where the horses would rather be somewhere else than endure what I was throwing at them, getting them to move in the direction I wanted them to. Now that I had a wind law, it was fascinating to get everything working the way I envisioned. It was like the pieces were starting to come together, and the painting of what I wanted was fading into frame. Even though it wasn't for a battle, to have my skills, the three I had built up together, mesh like this was a sight to see. Permafrost weaved through the ground, chilling and freezing the earth. Desolate Blizzard blew through the air, building my domain further, so it wasn't just the earth that was mine, but the air above it as well. Then sweeping snow came in, riding on the buffeting winds, ready to cut and slice anything inside. It grew empowered, riding the winds around me instead of having to propel outward by themselves. If both my laws got added to the mix, it was a force of nature to behold. I still didn't have the control over wind I wanted, not like my ice, but I was working on it. Once I got wind manipulation like my mother, things would go a lot easier, but I was doing what I could without it. My affinity and law aided me, but I was still new to the experience. I pumped mana into my skills until it was a nippy cold. Anything more was overkill, and I wasn't sure how the foals would take it. After that, I fired off an ice arrow into the air before hitting it with shatter That was my signal to the rest of them that I was starting. After that, I started closing in on the herd at a slow jog. Some of the horses began to pick up on something wrong and raised their heads in the air, pausing their grazing while the others remained oblivious. More and more perked up and stopped grazing as I got closer before the first one broke off into a run. After the first did it, more charged off to follow, running away from the surge of power they no doubt felt. Rachel and Gabriel talked the most about my aura, and I was attempting to utilize it better than I had been. Most of the time, I practiced not letting it billow out of me without restraint, but now I tried to do the opposite and project it. It was an entirely new skill and was slow going, but I was making progress. Much slower progress than other areas, but it was still progress. What held me back the most was I didn't see the point. Hiding it, letting it out, it didn't much make a difference to me. That was until Gabriel told me what he could feel from an aura, and I was informed of the fact I was giving information away. Mostly it was the fact people could find me because of it, like how Tracy had found me in a city full of people. Plus, it was how the beasts seemed to know where I was when I attempted to be stealthy. What little practice I had with the skill didn't do much against the horses, but I liked to think it did. Even though it was 100% my skills and the force of nature I was building up, I felt my aura practice had something to do with it. As the horses broke and started racing away from me, they started to form up like we anticipated. The stallion took the head as the others fell in behind him based on strength. After they started running, Austin and Hal broke in at a sprint from the sides, keeping them from going left or right as I charged after them. As soon as they felt constrained by the two new additions, things started to get dicey. Mana flared inside the herd and their speed picked up, forcing me into a full sprint to keep up while Austin and Hal had to do the same. They made attempts to break out, but a light beam or wind arrow forced them back into line as we closed in on where the pen was built. The walls came into sight first, but the lines of people were visible soon after, and once the horses saw that, they went buck wild. Both lines of people leading away had to shield themselves as the horses tried to break free, and a few managed to get out of our lines, but the majority weren't able to. We paid specific attention to keep the stallion in line, and most followed after their leader. It rammed and kicked, trying to break out of our encirclement, but it was finished the moment our lines swung shut. After the herd closed in close enough, everyone swung in behind them, forcing them into the funnel we had built. Seeing the only possible exit, they broke off through the funnel and into the gate into the awaiting arms of Jonathan. They seemed to pick up speed seeing the lone man waiting for them at the end of the funnel, but they were in for a rude surprise. If they thought they were getting through him, they had another thing coming. Chapter 153 Frustration. Chris. Point of view. I trusted Jonathan fully to take care of the other end while I shifted my focus to what I needed to do next. The herd was through the gate and now it was time to close it. A giant, icy bastion sprung into existence to block off the gap while the builders ran in from the sides to fashion the gate closed. My wall of ice was plenty strong to keep the horses in while the builders worked to secure the gate. The only thing left was to have Sarah start working her skills and see how long this would take. "Sarah," I called out to her loudly. I wasn't sure where in the camp she was, but my voice was loud enough to be heard. "You're up, Sarah." Point of view. "You're up." Christopher's voice resounded over the neighs and the sounds of hooves as she stared over the rambunctious herd. She had just watched John tank the charge of the entire herd and stop them dead in their tracks. Took a moment for her to react after what she saw. John and her had trained together whenever the chance arose, but she had never seen him do something like that. It was like he was an insurmountable wall that you could only shake your head and back away from. When his skills flared, there was something else there that gave off the feeling that no matter how hard she tried, she wouldn't be able to get past him. Sarah had to shake her head to get it straight and dismiss the useless thoughts. She had a job to do, and she wasn't going to mess up the first time she was needed. When she originally accepted Christopher's offer, she didn't know exactly what it entailed, but she did know that she wasn't going to be a ranger anymore. The opportunity to change her class took her attention away from what she was changing it to, and she only realized what her new class was after the fact. She wasn't upset with her decision or had any regrets, but she hadn't known the direction she was going when she first said yes. Gaining her affinity helped, and it eased her into her new class tremendously. Nature had a wide breadth of possibilities, and it didn't always mean plants. It also touched on animals as well, and that made her job a lot easier. Soothing voice, had worked on the wild animals they had captured before, but this was her first time using it on something so much stronger than her. Getting Soothsay to upgrade made it so much easier to calm animals down, and they took to her voice way better than before. If that hadn't happened, she didn't think she would be able to do anything to the horses. With all the hunting and training she had done, she had a few more skills to help her, but she was still in for a challenge. While she had ridden horses before, she had never had to tame one, and she was nervous about doing it. She didn't want to let Christopher down after everything he had done for her. Without him, she and her brother would still be starving in her crumbling house. She set her face and gained some determination after thinking like that. If she could survive then, she could tame a few horses. "All right, nice horsey," she cooed at the nearest one, starting to work her skills. "Abigail. Point of view. It doesn't seem to be going very well," she sharply pointed out. Christopher sighed from beside her. "It will. Give her time." Abigail looked back at the whining horse that Sarah was trying, and failing, to calm down, and frowned. She had been at it for almost an hour and had no luck so far. The gnawing feeling in her stomach that she couldn't get rid of was rearing its head, and she couldn't help but vent her frustrations. The horses are nearly double her level. You've given her an impossible task, and even if it is possible, it will take a while to get through all of the horses. There are over 50 of them, and she hasn't even tamed one of them," Abigail rebutted, frustration clear in her tone. Christopher turned to look at her questioningly. "What would you have me do? I am no tamer, and I've done all I can to help. There is nothing more we can do but wait. I believe in Sarah as much as anyone, but you have set her up for failure," Abigail shot back. He then fell silent for a moment before fixing his gaze back on where Sarah was working. "What is this actually about? I know you are not mad about the horses," he asked, calmer than the rising voices from before. It was Abigail's turn to sigh now. She had been trying to keep her rising frustration down, but it had leaked out anyway. The past few weeks hadn't been the best for her, but she was trying to overcome it. He was right in that she wasn't mad about the horses, but she couldn't help but get angry standing next to him. "What isn't there to be mad about?" she said. "We travel all day and sleep on the ground at night. People come and go constantly, making it impossible to keep track of everything. Your solution to any lasting problem is, we'll make do, and no one has been advancing since we returned. Vinny barely gets any essence from crafting. John doesn't get any from being a merchant if you do all the negotiating, and I haven't gotten any since the tutorial ended. The only person who has gained any levels of real value is Austin." She listed off. She hadn't meant to have this conversation now, but it was as good a time as any. It was a discussion they needed to have, and she couldn't keep putting it off. "There's nothing I can do about any of that. I want to level as much as the next guy, but we can't make anything more permanent until we reach our destination, and that won't be for a while," Chris pointed out. Abigail knew that it wasn't his fault. She knew she was just taking out her frustrations on him, but that didn't make her any less angry. Angry about things that had been building up for a while that she was just now letting out. And what of Anna and Josh? They need stability now more than anything, yet we can't give them that. I can't give them that because we haven't placed the pylon. They need a roof over their heads and meals to eat, not to be sleeping on the ground inside a tent and eat only what we can forage. They need to be in school. They need structure and security, and I can't give them that." She vented loudly. That was the crux of the matter and what had caused most of her rising frustrations. Her children needed something that she couldn't give them, and it killed her inside for that to be so. The whiplash of being pulled inside a mystical tutorial was hard enough to process and get through, but now they were back. They had returned to a planet in ruin, and she was freaking out about it. Her mind was still stuck on the fact Anna should have had a schedule she had to keep. Swim lessons were starting soon, and Josh had t-ball to start. They had a summer vacation planned, and all of it was out the window. It was hard enough to keep it together in an unknown land facing a rising threat, but now they were back. They had returned to their house. They had seen what remained of what they had once known and held familiar. The dichotomy of what they should be doing, the plans they had made for the summer, and what they were actually doing couldn't stop showing up in her head. There were no outside forces making her keep everything contained. No more waves to force her into action and distract her from all the little things that had built up. She'd had to dismiss anything that wasn't readily important for their survival before, but that wasn't the case now. That counterweight was now gone. There was nothing for her to keep her mind occupied with while her worries bounced around in her mind. It was almost a struggle to lay her head down at night when she knew all she would be able to think about was how she was failing. Failing as a mother. Christopher just stared at her blankly after her outburst. She had increased in volume as her rant extended, and by the end, she was nearly shouting at him. Immediately after doing it, she felt bad. It wasn't his fault she was feeling this way, and John had said as much when they spoke about it. But she couldn't help but point the blame at him. It was easier that way than blaming herself. "I didn't know you felt that way," he said softly, still shocked at her sudden outburst. "I'm sorry, Chris. I shouldn't have yelled at you." She apologized. The heat had left her now and regret replaced it. She knew he didn't deserve that, but she couldn't help how she felt. "You've seen the map and you know our plans. You know everything I do regarding our path for the future. How do you want to change it?" he asked. "If you think I am doing something wrong, tell me so I can fix it." Any of the wind that was left in her sails thoroughly left her now. He didn't come back combative at her outburst but asked for advice. For her input on what they could be doing better. "I don't know, Chris. I can't help but feel stifled, bottled up, on the road. I want to put down roots and build something, anything to feel at home again. The months of the tutorial were fine when we knew we would be able to get back home, but we don't have that anymore. We don't even have a home anymore. We're going on this one-way trip into the unknown with no guarantee it will work, and it worries me. We have nothing to fall back on." She ranted. Most of the solutions to our problems would be solved by placing the pylon, and it's hard to think of other ones. She sighed. Chris approached and gave her a giant bear hug as she sighed. Even though it would do anything to fix their problems, it was his way of trying to comfort her. It put a small smile on her face seeing him do things like he used to. "We can speed up our travels and stop at fewer places. The horses should help in that regard, but we can also cut out some of the spots we had planned," he said, holding her shoulders after they broke apart. He started smirking. "Unless you still think the horses a waste of time?" She let out a laugh at that. He was right. It wasn't the horses she was mad about, and they would speed up their travels tremendously. She didn't know by how much until they were tamed, but they looked like they could pull the carts at a great speed. Way better than the walking speed they were going now. They'll shave down the time by a lot. Maybe we'll get there before the year ends, she said before she thought of something else. The thought made her smile widen as she taunted Chris. "You know, we might need to make a timeline for 9 months. He looked at her curiously and tilted his head to the side. "You've heard the activities some partake in at night. What are you going to do if someone gets pregnant? Are you going to have them give birth on the road in carts?" She joked. Heightened perception was good for a great many things. Traveling in large groups with couples was not one of them. Any with the stat as their primary one had it the worst, but even higher-leveled people had trouble not listening when they didn't want to. His face nearly turned white after hearing that, and he stood stock still. His mind hiccuped, no doubt trying to get the image out of his head. It took everything in her not to burst out laughing. They wouldn't, but they would use, but there are none. He struggled with that before looking back at her. "Yes, we will get there before then. Even if I have to tie you all together and charge ahead, we will get there in 9 months. Slow down there, cowboy. I was just giving you a hard time. Mostly we don't have to worry about that yet, that I know of, but I was just pointing out that it's a possibility," she said before pointing Chris in a different direction. "Why don't you go and help Sarah? She seems to be getting frustrated, and that won't help with what she's trying to accomplish." "Yes, that I can do. I'll leave worrying about the other thing to you," he said before walking away quickly. She snorted as he departed. It wasn't like it was leprosy. He didn't need to treat it like it was a disease. At least they would be raising their pace, and that was all she could ask for. It wasn't a permanent fix to their problems, but it would help speed things along. She couldn't help but yearn for a schedule. A pattern of her day she could plan out and stick to and get rid of the unknowns plaguing her. Chapter 154. A New Form of Travel. Chris. Point of view. It took Sarah a while to tame one of the horses, and after seeing how long it took, I looked for a way to speed things up. I think the reason she was able to tame one at all was because they had been domesticated before. Without that, I didn't think her abilities would have been able to bridge the level gap. One had to remember that she had no laws or anything else to boost her power, only the skills her class gave along with the ones she had been able to upgrade. Someone came up with the idea of separating the horses, so she only had to focus on one, and that sped up things dramatically. It was a mystery why I hadn't thought of it before, but it was nice to have that idea early rather than after we were most of the way through the herd. Separating them out was difficult, but I left that to others. They had to work in groups, and multiple people had to be around to put up walls quickly in case something went wrong. But they managed to wrangle them fine. After that, things sped up for a different reason. Sarah gained 2 levels from successfully taming her first horse. She was despondent about it taking so long at first, but after some encouragement, she went back at it with vigorous enthusiasm. Her pace steadily picked up as she leveled, and she even reached the threshold for an evolution and acquired multiple new skills. Sarah kept what she picked secret, but whatever it was worked wonders. As Sarah raced through the levels and the number of tamed horses grew, we ran into a different issue. We had no yokes pre-made for them. Looking back, that was a planning failure on my part, and I should have thought of that, but there wasn't anything I could do about it now. Sam and Ashley got to work with the only other leatherworker in our caravan, pumping them out with Vincent's help. I pounded out a few rivets and clasps when I could, but most of the metalwork was done by Vinny rather than myself. The pace they could make the harnesses and yokes started out faster than Sarah could tame, but that shifted as she leveled. It went from having more harnesses than horses to having more horses than harnesses. Felt like by the end, we were chugging along at a blazing pace. Horses were being passed through the camp, fitted with harnesses, and then hooked up to the carts in record time. By the time we ran out of carts to hook them up to, we had the process down like a well-oiled machine. The second problem we ran into was while the horses were tamed and wouldn't run off, that didn't mean they were trained. They were obedient, like they were used to human presence, but they did not like the harnesses and tried to buck out of them when they could. It wasn't like people of the modern age were conditioning horses to pulling carts except for the Amish, but we didn't have those horses. They liked pulling the carts even less. It was worse when we tied multiple together to only one cart, as they tried to fight each other as much as fight the harness. Sarah had to be called away from the taming efforts to settle the fighting horses a few times because it got so bad. The horses had to be eased into the process, and we couldn't just slap a harness on them and expect them to be fine. While that took more time, it was necessary if we wanted anything close to functional work out of them. We had to refine the process after that. People who didn't have anything to do, or people with professions that weren't accessible on the road, were tasked with breaking the horse in and getting them accustomed to the harness. All told, it took Sarah several days to get through all the horses, and she blew by the evolution at level 25 and made her way well past it. Sitting solidly in F rank by the end of it, I had to take her aside and explain a few things before she kept on leveling. About the requirements and whatnot. Plus, we advised her to wait until she chose a profession and leveled it up to match. She was young, and there was no need for her to rush. Evening her class out with a profession would be best. Especially now that she would live longer than a normal human. Based on her stats, and if she managed to get a body of wood, I'd say she'd live till 130 or 140. Maybe even 150 if she picked up a profession that was vitality heavy. Her evolution would be delayed anyway because she had neither a law nor any of the other paths to make the jump to E rank. She had shot up through the levels faster than I thought possible, but now she had time to slow down and touch on the parts she had left behind during her mad dash. Both Jonathan and I spoke to her about the possible paths of power, and she was still deciding which to do first. We didn't have a nature-attuned body refining technique for her, but we had a few she could choose from if she wanted to branch out. Mine wouldn't suit her well, but some of the others would. Water wasn't that far away from nature and could be combined into something decent, and we had a few different water techniques. The only person who would have needed a nature attunement wasn't with us anymore to necessitate it. Still, Hal had a wind technique and Rachel and Vinny shared a fire one. While I felt both were less compatible than water, I wasn't going to tell her what to do. We could even go back to the unstructured poison technique if she wanted. Poison and nature would go perfect together, if that was what she wanted. The choice was hers, and hers alone, and I wasn't going to make it for her. While we had all of the techniques, most of them hadn't been used yet. Most bought them as their tutorial reward, and we had yet to get a chance to break them open. My new technique included. Most needed a specific environment we hadn't come across or hadn't had the opportunity to make yet. The fire one specifically was going to have to wait until we could build more permanent structures. Both Jonathan and I cautioned against going for her spirit anchor first, as that was the one that would take the longest. I advocated for getting a law first, and Jonathan agreed. We didn't try to push her toward it, but laid out why we thought that way and gave her a few examples of the ones people had. Almost everyone in the caravan stepped on that path of power first and started with laws. Other than the few mishaps, the days passed and the horses were trained and conditioned. I couldn't help but notice the dormant frustration. After Abigail opened my eyes to it, it was all I could see. It hadn't even been 2 months, and people were already fed up with the caravan life. It made sense, and I couldn't blame people for it, but there also wasn't anything I could do about it. I just hoped that public sentiment would pick up after we started moving again. If the initial trials with the horses were anything to go by, we would be making record time, so hopefully that would help. Nearly triple our average speed, and that was with mostly untrained horses. Another good thing that came out of taming the herd was we could now be a lot more liberal with the things we packed away. Before, when manual power was used to pull the carts, things too heavy or unneeded were thrown away or left behind. One would think a heavy Assonville would be on that list, but Chris had the big muscles to pull it. Now that we had beasts of burden, the things we could take with us grew tremendously. I had to crack down on a few people that took it a little too far, but most were just happy to bring along more possessions. It brightened people up a bit and warded off the travel fatigue. Our new massive traveling companions helped as well. It made me wonder if there were therapeutic horses like there were dogs before, because after getting tamed and readjusted to human interaction, they certainly raised people's moods. While the entire taming process went mostly smooth, there were a few off-key notes along the way. The harnesses and training were one, but the other one was obstinate horses. Some, no matter how hard Sarah tried, refused to be tamed. Even when she leveraged all her skills and newfound levels, they wouldn't cooperate. They liked their newfound freedom too much to be broken again. The former leader of the pack, the stallion, was the worst of them. Sarah described it as giving off a rippling loathing at the attempt to be tamed by something weaker than it. It kicked, bucked, and tried to trample her any time she got close, and all her skills slid off to no effect. There were a few other horses, particularly the stronger ones, that were in a similar boat. They would not come under her control no matter how hard she tried. For those, they required a personal touch from me. I sat outside their pen with a few of my skills at the ready while Sarah went inside. I tried to leverage my presence against them, and they knew I was done playing around. While the other holdouts fell to that, the stallion refused. With me standing outside and bearing my metaphysical weight down on him, he refused to be tamed. I still remembered the look on Sarah's face at what I did next. "Sarah, why don't you step out for a second?" I said slowly. If the horse wanted to play, I would oblige it. She looked back and forth between me and the horse with a tired and worried expression. She had been working nonstop for nearly a week getting all of them under control, and her sleep was falling behind. After spending days, constantly with the creatures, she had grown overly attached. Well, maybe not overly, but she quickly came to care for them and did not want to see them hurt. She even ridiculed one person who was treating one wrong for 5 minutes, berating them about doing it the right way. How she knew the right way was beyond me, but she somehow did after spending time with them and figuring out what hurt and didn't hurt, what was uncomfortable and what wasn't. "Come on, Sarah. I don't want you to get hit on accident." I prompted a bit more forcefully, with an accompanying beckoning motion for her to leave. Her face scrunched up in conflict ion at my prodding, and she looked back at the last horse she still had to tame. It was the only one remaining, all the others were tamed already. I opened the gate into the pen, walking through without arms or armor toward the snickering horse. Sarah finally caved as the beast puffed up at my entrance and scurried out of the way, but not before saying, "Just don't hurt him. He's just a little strong-willed is all." After saying that, she retreated outside the pen, leaving me alone with the creature. The horse snorted and prodded at the ground, seemingly trying to assert dominance, but it only made me smile. Strong-willed is good. I can appreciate strong-willed, but obstinate, less so. You've had your chance to do this the nice way. Now you get to deal with me. And let me tell you, my words aren't as soothing, I said as I drew closer to the horse. I wasn't sure if it was intelligent enough to understand my words, but it didn't matter if he didn't. He would soon come to understand my meaning even if the words failed. I was unarmored and I left my hammer leaning against the gate, but they weren't necessary. My strength of body was enough to get him in line, and I feared permanent injury if I smacked it around with my hammer. The beast fought and strained, kicked and charged, but in the end, it didn't win. Even without my hammer and skills, my pure stats were enough to cow it into submission. It only took a little elbow grease for it to finally come around, putting it in its place and bringing it down a few pegs. That was fine enough to deal with. I finally found a suitable replacement to pull my cart, and this one seemed like a fine specimen. It would soon learn the weight of what I was tasking it with. After our bout, it finally allowed Sarah to tame it and cooperated with her through the process, even if it still held on to some of its previous convictions. For whatever reason, it refused to travel anywhere but the head of the procession. It would fight me if it had to follow behind anyone else. Even though it took a touch longer than anticipated, we were on the road again and traveling at record speeds. We had a new form of travel and it was fabulous. Chapter 155, What Lies West. 2 months. It took us 2 months to come upon civilization again. Well, civilization that was more than stragglers and small groups living in the newly created wilds. After leaving what used to be the capital of Indiana and taming the herd of horses, we were off at a speed orders of magnitudes faster than our previous walking and covered an amount of ground to match. We could have shortened that duration and stopped at a place found along the way, but no one was willing to do so. Some for the fact they didn't want the delay, and others for the feeling the city gave off. Even from the distance we came across it, it wasn't a place I wanted to stop. Chicago was irrevocably changed, and it was nothing like it previously was. The Windy City was missing all of its buildings and seemed to be in even greater disrepair than the previous city we visited. Nothing was still standing, and the tallest structure left was a pile of rubble stacked no higher than the average human. It looked like a war-torn ruin. Flashes of skill use and the feeling of dense mana in the area gave an ominous feeling no one had the desire to intrude upon it. Something was going down in the city and no one wanted to become a part of it. Lightning flashed and huge storm clouds revolved around the city like it was the city itself that generated them. Lightning arced down into the rubble at random intervals only to be matched with a corresponding deep rumble seconds later. As we came upon it riding in our improved caravan, no one disagreed when I made the executive decision to bypass the city and keep on our way. Even the usual few who departed our caravan with second thoughts didn't think the city was a viable spot to settle. We moved on from the city and gave it a wide berth as we traveled around it. The wilds of Wisconsin were similar to the 2 previous states we traveled through, with one caveat. The mana level here was much higher than where we had come from, and it was in a form beneficial to a number in the caravan. Being as close to the Great Lakes as we were, Lake Michigan specifically, water mana was abundant around the coasts. The higher level of water mana persisted until we were a few miles away from the coast and gradually fell way to nature mana. The trees and forest here thrived from the mixture of mana and gradually lessened as we traveled further from it. A gardener in our employ explained, saying the mana mixture was just right for plants to thrive, and by God they did. They were so thick we almost needed to cut through them on our way through the state. Luckily, the environment only lasted for a short duration, and as the mixture became less water and more nature, the thick flora fell back to normal levels. Well, normal levels for our current situation. It was still way higher than normal levels from before. It would turn into a great spot to grow crops and food if the levels of monsters in the area weren't similarly inflated to match the plant growth. It made sense for the two to go hand in hand, but unfortunate for whoever tried to tame the area. The beasts had started to become threatening long before reaching what remained of Chicago, and they only became worse the farther north we went. They gradually went from the rare E rank to frequent E ranks, to all of them firmly in E rank. We had to revise our scouting groups and double up some of them. Austin and Hal couldn't go gallivanting through the woods with the same carelessness as before. Both could handle their own, but if they were caught unaware and ambushed, that could change. Even I had to step in for a few of the higher-level challenges. It wasn't strictly necessary, but I didn't want a chance losing anyone along the way. These people had traveled with us for months by now, and it wasn't worth risking a casualty when I could easily dispatch any of the beasts. For most, it was the first time seeing me fight, and they were understandably impressed. Even though I didn't have to go all out, they were still bewildered with what I did show. It made me want to laugh. They had barely scratched the surface of my strength, and they were already impressed. What would they do when the need to unleash everything arrived? While we had traveled and grown closer with everyone accompanying us, I didn't yet trust all of them completely. Some of them were complete strangers when they joined, and holding no cards in reserve was a fool's game. I advised Austin and Hal to keep some things hidden, just in case, and I did the same. Those two fought the most and were seen doing so the most often. Rachel and Jonathan did as well to a lesser degree, and I advised them to do the same. I didn't think ill of the people who traveled with us, but it never hurt to be careful. While the trip became harder, our speed only increased. The horses grew comfortable with pulling the carts, and the people handling them grew more experienced. What made the most difference was knowing what certain terrains would do to our traveling speed. Thick forests were obviously detrimental, but sometimes it was easier to travel straight through them rather than going around depending on the size of the forest. All of that came with experience, and we were quickly becoming more efficient about knowing which was faster. One of the best things that happened was my level hit 60. While stepping in happened infrequently, that didn't mean we didn't come across dungeons on our way. They were scarce and infrequent, but with the amount of ground we covered, we were bound to come across a few. Most didn't have the same number of floors as the first we came across, but some went deeper. The ones with fewer floors were swiftly bypassed with barely half a day dedicated to their stop. The few who could benefit from their depths had the chance to run them, but otherwise we moved on. The deeper dungeons, though, those necessitated a longer stop. The two we came across that went deeper than 6 floors were the longest stop. We still didn't spend the week like we had before, but longer than the half day for the others. 1.5 or 2 days spent on the 2 dungeons wasn't that much of a delay, especially now that our pace was so much faster than before and the trip didn't feel as daunting as before. Before, when looking at the map to track our progress, each day only added a small line to indicate how far we made it. Now, those small lines turned into decently sized segments of progress. It did a lot to ease people's frustrations and dispel some of the fatigue that built up. The skill I was offered at level 60 had me riding a high note for weeks, chipper and smiley for days after getting it. The list of skill choices wasn't as large as my other classes, but the 3 I was able to choose from all promised powerful upgrades. Seeing the kinds of skills offered made me want to go back and hug my past self for picking the class. It was exactly what I wanted and would fit into my fighting style perfectly. I could hardly wait for a chance to try it out in a real fight. None of the beasts necessitated such force, sadly, and I took most down swiftly to not ruin the meat and so that the animal could be used productively. Smashing them to smithereens helped no one, even if I really wanted to use my new skill. Plus, it wasted good parts which I was unwilling to do. Ruining the meat for no good reason made it feel too close to killing for sport, and there was no need for that. I had had enough senseless slaughter. Everything we killed had a use, and with the amount of mouths we had to feed, we had to make the things we came across last. Speaking of mouths to feed, the horses were an upkeep that no one expected. I had assumed they would graze on the grass as we traveled, but that turned out to be not as true as first assumed. While they did graze when given the chance and seemed to enjoy it, Sarah was adamant they weren't getting enough food from the grass alone. It was similar to what I had felt when eating lower-leveled meat, and it wasn't as filling. While the grass could sustain them normally, we were asking them to pull heavy carts for hours at a time every day. The grass alone wasn't enough. For the days we spent inside the dense foliage it was, but everywhere else supplementary nutrition was required. Being where we were was probably one of the only saving graces to the issue we faced. Without it, we would have had to cut back on how hard we pushed the horses so that they weren't strained enough to require it. One of the biggest things the Midwest was known for and famous for was farming. Farms dominated large swaths of area we passed through, and all of the different farms gave us ample opportunity to fill up on grains and crops. Doing so along our journey was the only thing saving us from having to slow down and search out other food alternatives. While what we passed was mostly abandoned and the fruit of the crop picked through and nibbled on by pests, we passed enough to take a sizable stockpile with us. Mostly corn, but there were other things as well. Oats and wheat were less common but still available. Even barley. The abandoned crops became less common the farther north we went, so we dedicated a few days to filling 2 new carts with the stuff before we left the area. Any farther north and planting season wouldn't have come before the tutorial pulled everyone away. The only reason the crops were even available in the first place was because some farmers got an early jump in mid-March before being pulled away. Having said crops stowed away was one of the reasons bypassing Chicago was an option. Without the need to stop and resupply, it became easier to ignore the potential problems of entering troubled waters. Besides Chicago and the rising challenge of the beasts, the 2 months we spent traveling were uneventful. People fell into a routine and became almost monotonous. One of the ways people spent their free time was trying to ride the horses. Most of us didn't know how and had never ridden a horse before, me included, and it was a fun way to pass the time while we stopped. It was on one of these stops that the monotony changed. I was trying to steady myself on Remy when Austin and Abigail walked over holding the map. "Whoa, whoa," I repeated, trying to get the horse to turn right instead of the circle we kept going in. The stallion didn't seem to appreciate the name I had given it, but that was tough luck. I liked it and I had won our fight. "Chris, we need your input for a second to settle something," Abigail asked, standing off to the side of the spinning horse. "Oh, come on, you two. Just get over it already. It wasn't like Connor did it on purpose," I said, exasperated. Another thing, people started to spend their free time on were pranks. Our resident alchemist enjoyed them the most, and he sometimes took things too far. "My hair was pink for a week," Austin exclaimed, trying and failing to sound indignant. He gave out just as much as he received, and if he was mad about a prank, he shouldn't be the mastermind of so many. Abigail had a different reason to be mad at Connor, but it was no less trivial. He had made a few fireworks for fun, and some of the younger kids ended up running around with magically enhanced sparklers one night. While I wouldn't say it was harmless, with magical healing and potions, the kids weren't in any real danger, and it was all in good fun. Fun that was just starting to come back, and I refused to smother it in its infancy. People needed a good laugh. Abigail disagreed. "Even though I still disagree, that isn't why we need you," Abigail clarified. I oscillated between looking at the two, and down at my horse, then back at the two, debating whether it was worth it. "Ah, fine. Remy was being fussy anyway," I said, and made to get off the horse. An indignant chuff was its only response, as if to say nah. Dismounting gave them the chance to unroll the map on a nearby tree as they got into the reason I was needed. "We are here," Abigail pointed, putting us somewhere in the northwest of Wisconsin. A few days' travel away from bending around Lake Superior and heading due north for a while. We were close to getting around the massive impediments called the Great Lakes. More like the Great Detours. "And we have kept our heading northwest for the past few days," she continued. "But Austin wants us to travel due west for some reason." She finished her statement by pointing at the man accusingly while I just looked at him confused. Why did he want to go due west? He took my silent question and explained, "I have gained a lot of experience these past few months, and everything my profession is telling me is that we need to go west." The usual carefree and joking manner he usually had was gone, and he seemed to believe in what he said, even if he didn't give any details. "Why though? It will add days to our journey, and for what? The only thing west is more of the same." "I won't add days to our trip just because you want to see a dungeon," I said. While we did make a few creative adjustments to hit certain things, those were close enough to add little more than a few hours to our trip. A slight adjustment to come across a point of interest rather than passing by a few hundred feet away. We had done the same to a few of the dungeons on our way. "Christopher, I'm not doing this for dungeons. We need to go west. I can feel it," he said firmly. "You have yet to give me a reason. How far west do we even need to go? You aren't very forthcoming with information right now," I answered, And what's even over there anyway? Tracing a line with my eyes west from where Abigail indicated didn't indicate anything of interest. A few dungeons here and there, but nothing stood out. There was an area where 3 were close together, but even still, that wasn't anything new. A dungeon was a dungeon, having 3 together while convenient didn't change that. The mana was a bit high, but nothing insane like a few other places on the map. The teal glow of Virginia only seemed to grow as the days passed. "Isn't that where the Twin Cities were?" Abigail commented as she did the same as me, but with her finger on the map rather than with her eyes. I was unfamiliar with where exactly cities were without them being points on a map, and the only reason I knew we passed Chicago was because it was sitting on the coast of Lake Michigan. Indianapolis was easy because I had been there a few times. Cities in Minnesota, on the other hand, were a mystery. If we're gonna detour by that much, I need a little more than a vague feeling. "That's weeks out of the way," I said, a little annoyed. To travel that far west and then back east to correct our path would add multiple weeks to our trip, and I wasn't going to just do that for a feeling, no matter how much I trusted the man. "There's something over there and we need to go west," Austin reiterated, yet stated nothing new. He almost seemed frustrated at being unable to put it into words. All of our estimates for food and supplies would have to be redone. The added time would have to be accounted for, and the horses would need food as well. The carts would need to be repaired again, and it would add more than just the travel time to our journey. Abigail rebutted. I gave Austin a look and said, "I'm sorry, bud, but if you don't have anything more to go off of, I can't agree to the detour. For now, we continue northwest." Chapter 156, Fight for the River. Now be careful. The muscles are still new and it will take a while to get used to again. Abigail lectured Gabriel, who was gingerly trying to stand on his new legs. The last healing session had just completed and she was giving him the final warnings about his regrown legs. "We will have to do physical therapy for the next few weeks to get your range of motion and the muscles stimulated, but it should be fine to walk on them now," she added. The healers had worked for months to get his legs regrown, and now it was finally done. I would have to do something nice for them because they worked tirelessly for countless days for this to happen. They hadn't had a full mana pool in weeks, spending all of it trying to get Gabriel able to walk again. The mana headaches alone were worth a gift in return, not to mention the completion of the job. My brother was giddy with excitement about his 2 new appendages, but Abigail successfully calmed him down enough so that he didn't go gallivanting off from his chair. While he had his legs back, they would take some getting used to. I got to watch as he took his first hesitant steps out of his chair, and the smile on his face was a breath of fresh air. Even though the visual progress of watching them regrow was hopeful enough, it was different to see them actually working. "Now maybe you'll think twice about charging a monster that's stronger than you," Abigail chastised. Gabriel didn't even acknowledge the comment as he was too busy walking around for the first time in months. While it was slow going at first, he was quickly getting the hang of it. His pace sped up quickly until he tripped and fell over an exposed root. "Careful!" Abigail reached out and caught him. "You still need to get used to it." They spent a while working through the different steps, but just being able to see him up and walking again felt good. Besides the occasion of Gabriel getting his legs back, we stayed our course. Much to Austin's disappointment. He tried a few more times to convince me, but none worked out. It was nothing against him, but I had more behind my decisions now. If this was the tutorial, I wouldn't have questioned it and went along with his directions, but this wasn't then. Nearly 200 people ambled along with us and over 50 horses. They needed food, supplies, and had a right to not be led on a wild goose chase. Not to say it would have turned into one, but there was no timeline involved with his detour. Winter was coming soon, we were in the back end of summer now, food would run dry eventually. If it was just me and him, things would be different. Too many people relied on my decisions to agree to his proposal. My talk with Abigail was also in the back of my mind. Sure, everyone knew what the plan was, go north and find a place to settle, but the longer that took to happen, the more people would leave. The trip was already taking long enough without concrete reasoning. I was hesitant to push things. I didn't think it would have mattered much anyway, because not a few days after Austin's proposal, the air turned heavy and an electric undercurrent buzzed through it, ready to ignite. Tension among the caravan rose subconsciously to match the atmosphere we were entering, and the horses started to get nervous, followed by the people driving them. Something was happening. "Chris, something's wrong," Gabriel said, walking up to the cart I was riding on. The group of trees we were traveling under had a small break in them which unveiled the sky to us, and what we saw did not spell good news. Clouds so dark they were nearly black, with flashes of bright purple jumping between them. The moisture felt heavy in the air, and it seemed ready to unleash it. A storm fueled with mana. "Set up camp. There's a storm coming and it looks nasty." I shouted out the order to stop. The dark clouds dominated the skyline, extending off in both directions as far as the eye could see. Even with Austin's detour, we wouldn't have been able to escape it in time and would have ended up doing the same thing. Our group was experienced enough to set up the camp in minutes, but I had us do a bit extra to make sure everything was secured. Mana-powered storms bordered on natural disasters from before. They had heightened levels of destruction to match their new arcane backing. Carts were staked down and shelters were thrown up. The horse barns came first and our tents followed after. As the storm blew in and the winds began to whip the tents back and forth, we were putting the final checks on everything to make sure nothing would blow away. Thunder rolled and lightning flashed a few times, and the first drops of the storm started to fall as I was heading back to my tent to get out of it. The weather was an odd thing since we had returned. Sometimes, it was just normal sunny skies or rain clouds like everyone had experienced before, but other times, the mana in the air spun and combined just right to give rise to some truly disastrous storms and weather. Sudden and fierce winds, thick heavy rain that came down with such force it stung to get hit with the raindrops. Lightning so charged it exploded deep craters in the earth, scorching trees and the like. Everything came together just right, that the mana altered and changed in the perfect way to create the ideal atmosphere for a storm. We had been through a few during our journey, but this one seemed to be the worst. It seemed like Mother Nature still didn't want to give its top spot as the strongest thing in the world. Even with magical powers and monstrous beasts roaming the earth, she found a way to get even more dangerous. If normal storms could accumulate as something close to a hurricane, what would an actual hurricane look like? Or any of the other natural disasters in the world? It was a scary thought to ponder, and as the storm blew through, we hunkered down to wait it out. Even I had to be wary of some of the lightning bolts that struck the earth. They were sometimes bigger than I was in thickness, let alone the power they carried. Marcus, point of view. His glaive sliced through the air and bisected another of the insects assaulting him. Before the momentum of his swing ended, he pushed on into another sweep around him, cutting through two more of the monsters. His swings were graceful and kept the blade ever moving through the air. Glaive mastery was one of his most important skills, and he made sure to always train it when he could. It was the only reason he was so graceful with the weapon now. A shout from behind made him turn to find another of the menaces trying to sneak up on him. Less intentional and more the fact there were too many around him and they were bound to attack his back. The bugs weren't smart enough for that. A powerful jet of water was enough to slice through its exoskeleton almost as easily as his glaive would have. Waterblade had been a staple skill that had seen him through many a fight. Its newly upgraded form was even better. As the last of the insects fell around him, he took the chance to survey the battlefield farther away. His men were struggling to contain the swarm, and they were slowly getting pushed back. Casualties weren't common, and he could see men getting pulled away before a serious injury landed. But this wouldn't last. Experience told him that much. These weren't even the strongest of the swarm, and they were getting pushed back. A few of his men close by also finished their fight and looked at him for direction. Ever since their return, he had taken leadership of what was left of his city, of the people who were left among the ruins, forced to fight off the monsters that inhabited it while they were away. Seeing how this battle would go, he had no choice but to sound the retreat. Fall back to the pylon. Carry the wounded first before following with a fighting retreat. His voice carried over the battlefield, and he saw the first groups shuffling off toward his walled city. The repurposed bricks and stone blocks were hastily put together when it was first built, but they were quickly becoming a series of vast fortifications. The builders worked tirelessly to make sure everything was as strong as possible, and the masons did the same. For if they failed, well, It wouldn't be pretty. They didn't have nearly enough of the professions for his liking, but there was nothing Marcus could do about it. He watched the wounded get carried off before more men followed with the barrels they had come with. That was the reason the fight had started in the first place. After the insects learned it was fruitless to throw themselves at the stone wall, they had fallen back to their home and defended it fiercely. Any access to the river was blocked, and they had to go through this song and dance every time they needed water, which meant they had to fight through the swarm every week so they could restock. In the early days, when he wasn't as familiar with the swarm's power, he had foolishly tried to fight through them and get at the heart. If he could kill the queen or whatever was birthing all of them, he would effectively kill them all. What he saw there still made his body shake in terror. The memory was enough for his knees to rattle. The raw power emanating out of the river's center was enough to level the entire city, let alone the deeper frequencies that were indistinguishable to him. Some artifact or treasure sprouted from the river's depths, and the swarm was its fierce guardian. The exact relationship between the two Marcus still didn't know. But one thing was for sure. Any intrusion upon the river was met with zealous resistance. Food was easier to come by, even if it was a bit distasteful. It took a while for people to come around to eating insects, but with the sheer availability of them, it was impossible not to. Every chance of finding water elsewhere was met with failure. The stone was too tough to dig through, and wells couldn't go deep enough. Lakes were too far away, and things other than the swarm defended those big enough to draw from. Even digging toward the river from the side set off the swarm. Sentiment in his city was low. Some wanted to leave, to abandon their home and search for somewhere else to live, but he refused. He would not leave his home. His family had lived here for generations, dating back to before the two cities were built next to each other. Back when what stood around him was just a small town next to an unassuming river that only had a few hundred citizens. He would not leave it. People who thought to leave only hesitated because the dangers of the wild were more deadly than what they were facing now. They had seen the beasts that roamed the woods, and even the prey animals there would pose them harm. They were stuck between a rock and a hard place, and anywhere they turned was a fight they couldn't handle. Either leave and brave the wild, or stay and fight the swarm every week to survive. As he monitored the retreat, the insects came buzzing back for another round as the last of his men were still making their way back to the city. But they wouldn't make it in time. He saw the distance close and knew they would be caught before they reached the city. "Get down!" he yelled out before powering his skills as his mana dipped even lower. His law was already shot as pain lanced through his brain at the thought of using it. He had to rely on just the power of his skills now. Water scythe after water scythe launched through the air, matching the swing of his glaive in a graceful dance. The arcs of clear liquid passed over the heads of the ducking warriors by mere inches before they tore the charging swarm to pieces, dicing them into tiny chunks that squelched as they hit the ground. "Clarissa, barbecue them," he ordered as the last man left the river hauling barrels full of the life-giving liquid. Acknowledging his order, the strongest mage they had stepped up and launched out great plumes of fire and smoke. She was one of his strongest assets, but they couldn't use her unless they were already retreating. The swarm hated fire, and any use of it would draw the ire of nearly all of them. Some would come flying from miles away at the sight of smoke. It was their finishing move to give them room to retreat and kill as many as they could before huddling in the city to do it all again next week. While the constant fighting was rough, it worked wonders for their levels. Crafters constantly had work to do, and so did the fighters. Smiths pumped out weapons and repairs as fast as they could find the metal to make them. Scavengers picked through the rubble of the city for anything useful, while the fighters held off the worst of the swarm. Armor of chitin covered nearly every member and only became more prominent as the days passed. "Sir, Erank's approach from the river. We need to leave," an aide said next to him. Marcus turned to look at the man, and it still shocked him to see such savagery, even though he wore the same and had the same things covering him. Viscous green blood covered him head to toe, while bits of dirt and blood smeared in, covering his metal-studded armor completely, only leaving the barest hints of leather visible. His aide was one of the few still sporting the armor from their tutorial. His weapon dripped with the insect's ichor almost as much as his armor did. It was a testament to how many he was able to take down, and Marcus knew He would look the same if there were a mirror. "Go, I'll cover our retreat," he ordered. He would be the last man in, as it always was. He was the strongest, and he was unwilling to leave anyone behind. As the last finally turned and ran, he fell in a step behind. Arcs of water shot out at any of the insects that came after them, and his glaive took any that made it close. The swarm made to retaliate, as it often did, and a dense cloud of bellowed out from the river's depths. His glaive once more came alive with mana and started to subtly glow from the charge he pushed into it. The enchantment on the weapon came alight, and he pulled on what mana he could before he ran dry. His pace was slow but steady, every step measured to make sure it wouldn't interrupt his swing. Momentum was his greatest ally, and breaking it would spell disaster. The flow couldn't be interrupted. Water began to leak out the end of his blade and got caught up in the swings of his weapon. Drops built up into the air before they, too, joined in the momentum. He pulled on water manipulation to turn the droplets into a rising current around him. It danced in time with his weapon, and he used it to beat back the wave of bugs coming to face him. Left, right, above and below. His reach with his weapon was near omnidirectional, and anything he couldn't cover with it, his water did. Streamers of it surrounded him, spinning in time with his swings. It blocked or redirected any attack that got through his guard and watched his back when his weapon couldn't be there. It took him a while to master his fighting style, but the weekly battles with endless opponents did more than just raise his level. He felt the pressure max out, and his skill was ready to be unleashed. Rising tides took precious time to build, but it was well worth the effect it could do. He channeled the enhanced power out of the skill and directed it into Flash Flood, adding the last of his mana to power it as high as he could. An explosion of force backed by the weight of several tons of water exploded out of him, pulverizing the closest bugs before sweeping the rest away. The wave of water crested higher than 10 feet in the air and charged out in all directions, gradually becoming smaller and smaller the farther away it went, dragging the bugs unwillingly with the momentum, if it didn't outright crush them. His skill killed anything close and incapacitated the rest, clearing the way for his men to retreat safely. Combining the two was a perilous process and ended in many failures until he managed it correctly, and it quickly became his strongest combo. And that combo came at a price. He staggered on his feet as the last dregs of mana left him. The pounding in his head only got worse from the mana deprivation, but he stayed upright and trudged back into the walls of his city. Today wouldn't be his end. One foot in front of the other was all he thought as he trudged through the gate. His men came to support him before he fell, and they shut the gates with a loud thud. Men and women alike manned the wall, ready for the swarm's retaliatory strike. Every member inside his city held a bow or wand with crates of arrows interspaced between. Even the warriors held them, as they could aim at the ground and still hit one of the insects of the swarm. Marcus had barely a few minutes to catch his breath before he had to be on his feet again to lead the defense. His only solace was the chime of yet another level. He knew this wouldn't last. They would eventually have to fight into the heart of the swarm, and a lot of good men would die. All Marcus hoped for was one more day. One more day of survival. He didn't chance it by wishing for too much. Chapter 157, Rising Challenge. Chris. Point of view. Come on, Chris, it will be fine. Just there and back. Nothing else. Gabriel once again tried to plead. Ever since he got his legs back a few days ago, he had been insistent about doing more. Joining with the other groups of scouts. Being a participant when an appropriate level monster was found. He had a law and was working on his anchor, but he still wasn't an E-rank yet, which made the monsters around here too strong for him. He could punch up if the beast wasn't as strong as its level would indicate, but most of the ones we came across were firmly in the E-rank, above what most people at that level could handle. Even some of the newly evolved E-ranks in our employ couldn't go toe-to-toe with some of the ones we encountered, which was why Gabriel asking to split off to travel to a dungeon was out of the question. Even if he could sense the monsters in the area and avoid them, I was not going to let him go alone, especially here. Gabriel, we've talked about this. The area is too dangerous for you to go alone, I said, exasperated. His insistence was fine at first, but it was beginning to aggravate me. I knew he meant well, but sometimes his ability to not take no as an answer was supremely annoying. I can avoid any of the stronger ones and the dungeon isn't even that far away. He tried. I turned to level my gaze at him and just stared. I was through with this conversation. The dungeon was far enough away that we weren't making a detour for it, yet he claimed it wasn't. I did have to admit, traveling alone on a horse wouldn't take nearly as long as the entire caravan, but it was still far enough away to worry me. And here I was worrying about him when I complained about Abigail doing it to me. I guess it's hereditary. It was at this point my mother decided to chime in. Why don't you go with him, Chris? If you two go together, everything will be fine. It will be good for him to get some exercise in. I turned to gape at her, my mouth slightly open in shock. Betrayed by my own mother. Was the world spinning in reverse? One where I was the worrywart and they were urging us into danger. Oh, don't look at me like that. You could use a chance to let loose too. I see you all tense and broody up there. She added. There was a reason for my tense and broody attitude. Things had slowly gotten more difficult, and ever since the storm a few days ago, things were becoming challenging. The entire trip, the mana level had steadily risen. It was slow enough that most attributed it to moving into more mana-dense areas. Places that were richer in it than others. That sentiment held for quite a while and no one thought anything of it. Until it continued to happen despite moving cross-country where the map showed ups and downs in mana level compared to where we had been before. Which didn't make any sense. The mana level was higher in some places than the map would indicate. That was when we realized the base mana level was rising everywhere. The scale of the map stayed the same, but the entire world rose in mana density anyway. The areas with low density rose but didn't change color on the map because everywhere else rose to match. There had been some shifting on the map where different areas dimmed or brightened, but overall things stayed the same. The mana levels of different areas stayed constant, which made the map stay the same even though the mana levels we were experiencing should have been lower. The only other explanation was that the base mana everywhere steadily went up. With that being the case, monster levels rose to match and we weren't leveling fast enough to compensate. I had only gained 6 levels since our return, a pittance to the 57 I gained in the tutorial, and about the same time had passed. Others did better and gained more, but it still wasn't enough to keep up with the levels of monsters we were beginning to run into. They were outpacing us. It wouldn't have been that big of an issue if we had already established our city and gained dominion over the local dungeons, but we were still a far distance away from doing that. The caravan was struggling to make headway further north and we had to use more and more of our strength to deal with the challenges we encountered. While that sounded mostly negative, there were good things that came out of it. The more challenging the monsters we ran into were, people's levels rose faster because of it. The materials we extracted from them and the area were better and our crafters could do better things with them. Plus, the challenge brought breakthroughs for people struggling to step on the paths of power. The number who did so was few, but a few more laws got added to our repertoire from the encounters. After a meeting, we decided to bypass a few of the points we had originally intended to stop at. The dungeon Gabriel wanted to go to was one of them. It was our original plan to stop there for a day before moving on, but the circumstances made us cut it out to save time. We were quickly becoming pressed for it for more reasons than one. Other than the rising challenge of fighting through the wild, Mother Nature was turning against us. Well, not against me, but against other people. I felt more at home as the days passed, but the same couldn't be said for the others. We left for the tutorial at the start of spring and we returned at the start of summer. It was just now becoming the start of fall. Winter would soon arrive and the air was already turning this far north. I could feel the barest hints of ice mana in the air already. Tree leaves began to turn first, and the air soon followed. It was a stark reminder of what was coming. I loved it. It felt easier to breathe, and as the heat died down, it felt easier to move. Gabriel felt the same, but we were the minority of people who welcomed the changing season. Most of the caravan's population came with us from Ohio. People who knew the cold and snow, but not the kind the land up here would see. Back home, we were lucky to get any substantial snowfall and the temperatures would only dip low for a short amount of time compared to here. It was the main reason we left. The part of my family who had water affinities could find that anywhere. Lakes, rivers, oceans, even snow, all of it gave off water mana, and while the levels and purity differed, it was at least available for them. Austin and his solar could be found literally anywhere, and so could wind. Both affinities were common throughout the globe. The type and intensity changed, but it could be found. Vinny and Rachel were somewhat out of luck for fire, but there wasn't anywhere we could go for that. At least nowhere that was closer than our current journey. The deserts of Arizona were smothered in the stuff based on the bright orange glow of that area on the map, but nowhere else had it in any large capacity. America wasn't known for its volcanoes after all. Fire mana popped up as a small blip in northern Pennsylvania or eastern New York. It was hard to tell, but that wasn't enough of an incentive to change plans. While there were spots on the map that were better for water mana or wind mana, there were few places for ice mana. Now that sounded altruistic in that we were going somewhere most people would have something to work with, but there was also a selfish side as well. This was going to be my city, and I was going to build it where I would be strongest. I wasn't forcing my family to come with me. While they were appreciated and I wanted them with me, I wasn't forcing them. If they didn't want to, they were welcome to set out for somewhere else, and I would support them wholeheartedly. While winter was the main reason we were traveling north, it did not mean people were ready for what they were about to experience. With winter soon upon us, we would have to make even better time if we were to make it there before the first snowfalls. We also had to make sure to recheck our food and begin planning and rationing. There was no way we weren't going to have to. There were too many people and too little food not to. We did our best to scavenge and forage, but it wasn't going to be enough to last the winter. It was another reason I couldn't agree to Austin's detour a week or two ago, as adamant as he had been. Future plans aside, the dungeon was removed from our journey, and it was one Gabriel had been looking forward to. He knew the timeline of his recovery better than anyone, and he spent ample time with the map. He knew roughly when he would be able to delve into one, and he had set his sights on it long ahead of time. He did not take our change of plans well. I had held firm on my decision, until my mom decided to sabotage me. I can't leave. Not now of all times. Maybe I could have before, but not when I could be needed. I rebutted. It won't take you that long, half a day at most. Get there, do your thing, then catch back up when we stop for the night. Not even half a day if you go through the night instead. She answered. As she continued, Gabriel's face got brighter and brighter, his excitement near bubbling over. She was doing this on purpose. We will be fine without you. We aren't as helpless as you like to think we are. She added, putting the final nail into the coffin. Fine, fine. We leave in an hour and only for one run. No more than that, no matter how much you beg. I pointed at him. And we're back before the morning. I don't care if we have to ride through the night. Yes, I'll get my stuff, he said excitedly before running off. With him gone, it left only the two of us alone. Was there a reason to rile him up? I don't need this right now, and you were the last person I thought would side against me. After what happened last time was left unsaid. He needs this, Christopher. As much as he puts on a brave face, he needs a win right now, and this will do that for him. My mother sighed. No matter how much I don't want him to. He's not alone in that department. A lot of people need wins right now. I pointed out. She just gave me a look. One that she gave me a lot when I was being a smartass. Not everyone is my son. Doing this for him is trivial, and it will make him feel better. I know, but this is a one-time thing. I won't be doing this again. I stated. I loved my brother dearly, but I wasn't going to compromise the security of our camp just because he wanted to go off dungeon diving. The only reason I was doing it this time was because my mother was right. It wasn't that far away, and I wasn't strictly needed here. We had enough ear anchors to cover everything. I was just paranoid that something unexpected would happen. That was another reason for my tenseness. I didn't have that much to pack. Really. My hammer stayed with me most of the time, and the only other thing I needed was my armor. That and my horse. Where did Remy get off to? Having a horse was a new experience for me, and one I was quite enjoying. It was similar to having a dog, but one you could ride. He was still working through his attitude problems, but he was shaping up to be a decent steed. I had no plans of riding him into battle or anything, but he made getting around significantly easier. I wasn't sure how he would handle the kind of fighting I did and didn't want to kill him on accident. A few people who wanted one decided to single one out to take care of and groom. Not everyone wanted one, which was good, as we didn't have enough to go around for everybody, but most of the people who did had the opportunity. I was on the fence at first but decided to try. Some companionship helped me work through some of the things I felt. Our family dog wasn't there when we returned, and Remy was quickly filling that hole. There were so many other things to deal with at the time I hadn't thought much of it. The world ending and all was a major distraction. I did wonder if any stayed and awaited their owner's return, though. Now that would be a good dog. Chapter 158, Dungeons. My horse riding skills still weren't perfect, but they were enough not to fall off while traveling at a decent speed. Full gallop was still hard to control, but I was getting there. I had yet to get the motion down, and it was uncomfortable to go faster. Gabriel was newer at it than me, with only recently getting the chance, but he was a quick learner. The week he spent getting the basics down was enough for our journey to be a quick one on horseback. Riding horses for transportation was just another oddity I had to work through that the new world brought. Nothing like trading out cars to go backward. The fact horses high enough level would eventually be faster than modern cars wasn't lost on me. Finding the dungeon was easy at this point, after how many we had encountered during our trip and the amount of times we had done this. The mana in the air funneled into the cavern leading into the earth and could be felt by a good distance away if you were looking for it. It was so noticeable to even my mana skills, let alone Gabriel's. He noticed it way before I did, and it didn't even take a cursory sweep on our part. Just riding close was enough. "I think this one is deep," he said, dismounting from his horse and beginning to tie it up. I followed suit and found a strong enough branch for my own. "How can you tell?" I couldn't at first, but the ones we found before help compare against what I feel now. The amount of mana it takes in and how far away the draw starts are good indicators of how deep it is, he said. Now that isn't always the case, and I'm still trying to get a feel for it, but it generally works. He amended. "How many floors deep is it?" "Enough for me to get a fight or two in," I asked, failing to hide my hope at the answer. If this one went deeper than 8 floors, it would be a perfect place for a fight. "I don't know, it feels deeper than the one we found a few weeks ago, and that one had 6 floors. So, maybe 9. I doubt it's more than that," he answered. The deepest dungeon we had come across only had 7 floors, and that was one of the first ones. While fighting in them was fun, it didn't pose the same challenge as the waves. I hoped the ones we built our city next to would be deeper. Dungeon curation was a profession on its own, similar to blacksmith or leatherworker, and was notoriously hard to get. The dungeon curator profession helped grow and take care of a dungeon, as the name implied. We knew some details about them, but not all. Information was sparse because the profession was held in high regard. Everyone wanted a good dungeon curator in their employ, similar to a good mayor or merchant. Their skills helped to grow a dungeon and speed up the rate more floors were added. They would also keep tabs on its condition to make sure it wouldn't break. Dungeon breaks happened rarely, but when they did, it would devastate the surrounding area, spewing all the monsters from the depths onto the surface for them to roam free and cause wanton destruction. Curators weren't necessary to keep tabs on a dungeon, but they made everything easier. The signs of a break were noticeable to others if they had the skills and knew what they were looking for. Their other ability, the hastening of dungeon growth, was what they were prized for. Dungeons grew slowly, and it took a lot of time and effort to do so. Any way to speed it up was greatly sought after. Dungeons were the backbone of a faction's strength, and finding a good one could cause a faction to rise in power. Dungeons and the area where a faction was based played the biggest part in how fast they would grow or how high they would reach. The only problem was Earth was still new to mana, and no one would get the curator profession for a while yet. Those were problems for the future, but it was something I thought about when it came up. "All right, are you ready? Got everything you need?" I asked. Gabriel gave himself a once-over, patting places to make sure everything was there before nodding. Potions were in place, and he had his wand with him. Staves and wands could be used as physical weapons, but they were meant to amplify spells. The gems or formations carved into them could empower the skills a mage pushed through it, similar to how my hammer amplified cold powers. "Let's go then." The first few floors held nothing new. Low-level monsters with the floor guardian capping it off. There were a few hidden alcoves and treasure chests Gabriel found, but they didn't hold much. To the level 10 or 20 who would struggle with the floor, the coins and treasure would be great, but for us it wasn't that much to get excited about. Some of the metal it dropped I could crush with my bare hands, it was so weak. It was disappointing to find that this dungeon was another material dungeon. Metal was what we had the most of, and it was the majority of what the dungeon gave out. What a dungeon would give as a prize was random. Could be as wide as giving anything: metal, wood, leather, hide, cloth, crystals, gems, skill shards, even mana stones on rare occasion. Some kept their pool diverse, giving a little bit of everything. Others specified, giving only metal or only wood. A wide variety or a specialized grouping depending on the dungeon, or a mixture of other things. Once the drops were established, they would never change. Not even a dungeon curator could get a dungeon to alter its drops. One thing dungeons never gave out was equipment. They gave out all the materials to make it, but would not give you a finished sword or weapon. Doing that would defeat the purpose of professions and was a handout the system deemed unnecessary. This dungeon seemed to love metal. It gave it out at every opportunity with a smattering of coins to go along with it, which every dungeon seemed to do. Coins were a staple in every dungeon we came across so far. I let Gabriel take care of most of the monsters while I sat back and watched him fight. I had seen him do it before, but I wanted to make sure he was ready to be back in a dungeon. Confirm there weren't any lingering doubts. It was mostly baseless, but I wanted to make sure. He fought similarly to Rachel, except instead of fire exploding out, it was ice. He took the barest sliver of the stuff and turned it into a weapon, flinging it masterfully wherever it was needed. "Do you not have shatter?" I asked after he manually exploded a chunk of ice to finish off a monster. "No, I didn't think it was worth it and picked up other skills instead," he answered before sending another bolt of ice into a monster ahead of us. "I plan to learn how to do it manually and spend my skills on something else. Care to share?" "You don't have to if you don't want to," I asked after he opened the door. I knew some of his skills, but he hadn't gone into detail about them. "You know most of them. Ice Spear R and Ice Arrow UN were the first few I picked up, evolving from Ice Bolt C. I have a few neutral skills from before I knew my affinity. Mana Shield C and Mana Bolt C specifically," he said. "I've upgraded them since then, but they function the same. I didn't know I had an ice affinity at that point and chose to go neutral. As much good that did," he muttered. I nodded along and waited for him to get to the big stuff. Those were common skills for mages to pick up, and I knew of all of them already. After evolving into Cryomancer at level 10, I picked up a few good ones. Frozen Grasp UN and Icicle Barrage UN were my main skills during the tutorial at the time. But I didn't only get attack skills, I have a few general skills and supplementary skills as well. Chilling Touch UN boosted my power by quite a lot, even though it isn't an attack skill on its own. His Chilling Touch UN mimicked my Pervading Cold R, in that it focused on the debilitating aspect of ice and added that to any other ice skills. It was in the same vein as Jonathan's Stone Empowerment. The skill was useless on its own and required something additional to work on. Stone Empowerment didn't do anything if there wasn't any stone to empower. "Oh, Spreading Ice R is a good one," he said with a smile. "I got that one through my current class and it's awesome. That was one I hadn't heard of and my face showed my confusion." "Here, watch this," he said. During his battles, he usually speared the monsters with a quick ice shard or two and we moved on. We were still on the higher floors and it wouldn't start being challenging for another floor or two. This time, instead of killing it with a well-placed Ice Arrow UN, he did something else. It looked like Frozen Grasp UN, but I wasn't sure. Mana flared as he activated his skill, and ice built up from the floor, ensnaring the monster's foot and immobilizing it. The monster bucked and clawed at it, but it wasn't strong enough to break free. After that, his mana flared again, and I could see the ice begin to spread from where it was already attached to the monster. Beginning at its foot, it quickly climbed up its leg before extending to the monster's torso. It cracked and splintered as the beast thrashed, causing shards to chip and fall off. But it continued growing and gaining ground. It grew all the way up its leg before spreading faster from there. As much as the beast tried to fight, it couldn't do anything to stop the spreading ice. It only took a few moments and the whole monster was encased in it, turning into an ice sculpture right where it stood. I just looked at it with surprise while Gabriel puffed up beside me. Cool, right? It only works on the weaker monsters and it can be broken easily, but it distracts them and makes openings for other skills. He explained after a bit despondently. What was that you used first? It felt like you used two different skills. I asked. Oh, that was frozen grasp. Spreading ice needs a base to work on. Any kind of ice works, even shards sticking out of them from ice spear work. All ice touching the target begins to spread and hinder them, he said excitedly. From what I saw, it looked like a great skill. Someone without an affinity for ice would be hindered greatly as it quickly spread over their body. They would be thrown off and wouldn't be able to move as well, opening them up to other attacks. Gabriel showed off a few other skills, but none were as flashy as spreading ice and the fights didn't allow for any big stuff. That would only come later. We traveled along the tunnels for a few more minutes and I could see out of the corner of my eye Gabriel starting to speak only to stop before saying anything multiple times. After multiple times of this, it got so frustrating I had to say something. What is it? Have you read the books Abigail packed away? He asked out of the blue while twiddling his thumbs as we ventured another floor deeper. Going from floor to floor was the longest stretch of time between fights. It was a bit out of left field, but I went along with it. Not all of them, but I've read most of them. The important ones. So you've read the one detailing the challenges Earth will face? He asked, going somewhere I wasn't sure I liked. I had an inkling I knew what he was after. If you're talking about the trials to keep the system's protection, then yes. I answered, but those won't happen for a while yet. It's not something to worry about for now. I said, trying to end the conversation here. I know, but I was just thinking of it and it got me curious about what you plan to do about them? He asked, looking up at me. There was an expression in his eyes I chose to ignore. It reminded me of when we were kids and he was looking to me for guidance. Ignoring his look, I chose to focus on what he said instead. The way he said it made me laugh. Like it was something I had sole control of and it was up to me to prepare for them. What do you mean? I don't have any plans for them. My only priority is keeping you and our family safe. Anything beyond that isn't as important. I said, brushing him off. You haven't thought about it? He asked, slightly aghast. Not even a little bit? I know they are coming, but nothing else. I don't even know what they will be. It seems kind of silly to plan for something when you don't know when, what, or even where it will happen. I answered jokingly. But you're the strongest person we've come across, probably one of the strongest in the area. You have to do something about them, he said animatedly. Even that one woman gave you a bunch of stuff because you were so strong. Calling what Tracy did giving me a bunch of stuff was a bit of a stretch. I paid her for what she gave us, but it was close enough. What he said made me stop walking and turn to him. It wasn't quite a dad voice that came out, but it was getting there. Gabriel, there are millions of people in the world, maybe billions still. It does not fall to me to do anything. My strength is not unique. There are probably thousands who are higher level than I am. I pointed out. They might be higher level, but are they stronger than you? You're the only person I know to have a least law, an anchor, and a body of wood. We have yet to meet someone who could beat you, and we've been through multiple big cities. He rebutted. I scoffed at that. We've been through maybe 4, and that hardly constitutes a thorough search. We've barely seen half the country, let alone the whole globe. He didn't let up and kept staring at me with a look like he didn't believe me. What do you want from me, Gabriel? If something is threatening my city, then yes, I will fight it, but I will not go out of my way trying to save the world. The world isn't my responsibility, you are. I said, firmly poking him in the chest. Keeping my city and my family safe is the only thing that matters. But what about the rest of the world? Gabriel started. You owe it to people to at least try. You owe nothing. I interrupted harshly. I owe them nothing, just the same as they owe me nothing. Just because I'm a touch stronger than someone or a level higher does not make me responsible for the entire world. It does not fall to me to do anything. I finished and turned to continue walking. We were talking about a future challenge that was years off at best. It didn't much matter what I said now, years could change things, but I doubted it. Gabriel had a skewed sense of heroism that the tutorial had thoroughly knocked out of me, and I had thought it did the same to him. He was probably picturing all the superhero comics he loved and was thinking that was what would happen in real life. Great power comes with great responsibility and all that shit. I just didn't hold the same opinion. Just because I was stronger than the average man did not mean I was forced to protect everyone. Death and destruction were a part of life, and no amount of heroism would change that. I would leave the heroics to others. I had experienced enough death. The ring I wore carried more than it should, and I wasn't about to add to that because of a fight that wasn't mine. The world was large, and I was but one man. There were bound to be people out there stronger than me. Chapter 159, First Marker. The rest of the dungeon was a bit of a wash. Gabriel got to fight on the lower levels, and he did pretty well in my opinion. He could fight up quite a few levels and only got stumped on the 5th floor. Ice Law helped him fight up a few levels, but he didn't really have anything else going for him. He was still working on his anchor, and he had yet to make a decision on his body technique. He still hoped to review more options. He had a good fight against the 4th floor guardian, which was a level 50 E-ranked ape-like creature, but stalled out not long after. The roving monsters of the 5th floor that grouped together were too hard for him to take down alone. Singular monsters that high level were fine for him, but the groups were too much. When he focused on controlling and killing one monster, the others charged at him and disrupted his flow. I had the feeling he could have won with a few injuries, but it wasn't worth it to let it go that far. We still had an hours-long ride to catch up to the caravan after this, and doing it injured would make things harder. I stepped in to play the front liner for him and held back significantly so he could participate in the fight. This was for him to get back into fighting shape, not for me to pummel the monsters into oblivion. Fighting with my brother was an odd thing. We were both so used to fighting alone that it caused some major mishaps we had to work through at the start. If I didn't have the fortitude I did, multiple wounds would have arisen because of our miscommunication. Gabriel had fought with other mages before, most of the time with our mother, but fighting with me was different as we both tried to control the same thing, let alone me standing in his way. For months, my fighting style was to sling ice around in arcs around me while using shatter occasionally. Sweeping snow now took the place of my revolving snowflakes, and I still turned the area into the Arctic with permafrost and desolate blizzard I could do it even better now with my upgraded affinity as well. The problems arose when I tried to have pieces of ice go one way and Gabriel tried to pull them in the other. Our coordination wasn't great, and us fighting over the ice caused it to go where neither of us wanted. It was frustrating on my part, as it was so ingrained in my fighting style to fight one specific way that altering that was harder than anticipated. Gabriel felt the frustration as well based on the swear words I could hear from behind me. We were still only on the 5th floor and the monsters were only early E-rank, but it didn't feel good to get beaten around because of a miscommunication. It took us longer to work things out than it did to fight the whole floor. Other than us vying for control, I had to learn a different aspect of fighting. One I had little experience in: protecting someone. During the first waves of the tutorial, we fought in groups where there were more set roles like this, but that was so long ago it was hard to remember. Most of the time I tried to kill things as fast as possible so none got by me. While that would work, it defeated the purpose of holding back and letting Gabriel level up. I had to use my skills much more defensively and control the fight in a completely different manner. It was a novel experience to do, and it was enjoyable to fight in a new way. While it wasn't the same as a good brawl, it was novel enough to be enjoyable. Icy Bastion took center stage while playing the front liner instead of my more destructive skills, and I stymied my aggressive blows for more controlled ones. It worked to both control where the beasts would go and cut them off completely from getting around me. If any tried to bypass me and get to Gabriel behind me, they quickly found themselves face first with a wall of ice. Skills weren't the only adjustment I had to make either. Using my hammer would have ended the fight just as quickly, and I had to adjust there as well. Because of my high fortitude and frost armor, I usually took an aggressive approach with my hammer. More heavy swings meant to deal damage rather than defensive ones. I had to change that now. While the hammer wasn't made to be a defensive weapon, it still could be used as such. The shaft of my weapon got a workout deflecting all of the different attacks, and different swings had the same effect. I targeted legs instead of skulls and chests, to cripple instead of kill. While the new style was new and exciting, it didn't beat the old way I did things. There was a certain feeling of primal destruction and fury. It made me feel that defensively warding off enemies was lacking. We pushed on like that, me fighting up front and Gabriel supporting from behind for the next few floors. After reaching the 7th floor, Gabriel's help started to drop off and I had to take up more of the slack. By that point, we stopped tripping over each other and began to work together more seamlessly. Not perfect, but no more stupid mistakes. We could even complement each other, or at least we started to. His spreading ice was the perfect casing to use shatter on, and my pervading cold helped it build much faster using the ice mana pervading its flesh. It started to get a touch fun by the end of the last floor and my heart started to pump faster and I got into the feeling I missed from the tutorial. Gabriel got increasingly nervous as we delved deeper and it was obvious he wanted to stop on the last floor, but we pushed through. The 7th floor guardian was even strong enough to leave some lasting wounds and draw blood. It was a shame it ended, but even if there was another floor we wouldn't have had time for it. We were already running late delving as deep as we had, and we would have to make good time getting back to catch up before morning. The last prize we got from the dungeon was a large chunk of unidentifiable metal that glowed to my senses. I didn't know exactly what it was, but it was higher grade of metal than normal. Metallurgy, helped distinguish different metals, but it didn't have the same ability as material analysis. Its failure to identify the metal meant it had to be a rare alloy or magical material. Vinny's material analysis would be better to confirm. It made me regret skipping the skill, but it didn't make sense for both of us to have it. Our return trip was uneventful and we were on the road again. I felt like I had been saying that a lot. On the road again. I was ready for this trip to be over, but we were still a few months out. While the horses helped, I wanted to sleep in an actual bed in a house that was more than a bolt of cloth and leather held up with sticks. I was also antsy to start construction. So many ideas and plans flowed through my mind and I wanted to get a look at where we would be building. Would it have large cliffs supporting waterfalls? Would it be at the end of a large plateau? The closer we came, the more excited I got. I may have driven the caravan a bit harder in my rush to finally get there, but the lack of complaining only made me go faster. The time we made was even better than before, reaching the border of what we thought was Canada right as fall began in full swing. The sight of the leaves changing color and drifting to the ground was almost enough to make up for our fatigue from traveling. It was beautiful. Looking out over a sea of reds, oranges, and yellows rolling in the wind with the occasional splash of color dancing through the sky was as breathtaking as it was nostalgic. Fall from before didn't have the sheer beauty that the northern forests did, but it was nice to see some things didn't change. Leaves still turned and seasons were still a thing. As we made ground into what used to be Canada, it got increasingly colder. It was usually a good few weeks between the leaves turning and the first snow of the year, but it happened back to back up here. Before the last leaves were on the ground, flakes were falling from the sky. Temperatures dropped so low at night that fire pits had to be incorporated and tents redesigned for smoke. It was a subtle change as the ice mana rolled in every night only to wane as the sun banished away during the day. More and more ice mana started to stick around during the day, building up no matter how hard the sun fought. I slept great regardless, but it was too cold at night to sleep without a form of heat for others. The leatherworkers started producing heavier clothes and furs became common attire as time wore on. Heavy cloaks for warmth and furs wrapped tightly around to keep heat in and moisture out. My attire didn't have to change, I could walk around shirtless and be fine, but I followed suit. It was partially for practicality, but mostly because I liked it. The heavy layers and fur were soft and comfortable, and they were much better than the scratchy cloth from before. Professions could do a lot, but making the softness of cotton and silk out of plant fibers was not in their repertoire. Snowfall started to hinder our progress, but we pushed on. Anything more than a few inches caused our progress to stall nearly completely, which was something I was not going to let happen. Not when we were so close. Remy refused to not be at the front, which put us in the perfect position to forge a path. Ice manipulation, and my growing skills without relying on the system were the plow guiding us forward. Pushing snow out of the way, while trivial, was a constant where to do for over 10 hours a day. After a few hours, the strain was enough to cause a migraine from sustained use. Gabriel and I had to split our travel into shifts to keep it a sustainable practice, otherwise I wouldn't be able to do it all day every day. The third and final thing that began to hinder us was sunlight. While the cold and snow were hindrances we could work through, sunlight was not. It wasn't as bad without clocks, but the days were still noticeably shorter. Waking with the sun and driving through the day until sundown gave us less and less time for travel, and our pace suffered for it. With those three things to fight against, people's moods plummeted. They did not like the cold, they did not like the snow, and they did not like the dark, which we had in spades. While it was frustrating for me to feel great, invigorated, and loving the cold, only for everyone else to be moody because of it, I got used to it. People would adapt. That or they would leave. Fortitude helped against the temperature, but that wasn't a stone-clad rule. We didn't have a thermometer, but I would bet money it was colder than before. Mana had an increased effect on environments compared to before. We couldn't even use water freezing to compare the temperature against. The new magical nature of it made the freezing point change based on the mana level, and we established that early on during our travels. All of it rolled together for a grumpy few weeks, better left unmentioned. People were snippy and quick to frustrated during the change and only mellowed out after getting used to it. Other people were scarce, but we did run into a few stragglers traveling about. People dropped back at their homes only for them to turn into the wilderness we now traveled through quickly had to adapt or die. The scarcity came from them either dying or leaving before we came through, but there were still a few still trying to carve out a living. Some joined us and others didn't. We received a decent-sized influx of people from the remnants of a town we passed through as all joined up with us, and they were more knowledgeable of the area. They were able to point out the different areas on the map with greater precision, and we could finally put a city name to our first marker. Just north of what used to be Winnipeg sat our first possible destination, and we were closing in after months of travel. I didn't hold out hope to find the spot after our first stop, but others did. It sat near the shore of what the natives called Lake Winnipeg, and two dungeons weren't far away off the northeast and west, a short distance away from the lake. Austin couldn't tell anything from his skills yet because we weren't close enough, but we would soon set eyes on our first potential building spot. I would be lying if I said I wasn't excited. Chapter 160, Wearing Patience. "Chris, the wolves are circling again," Abigail said as she approached the stump I was sitting on. As we pushed on toward the first marker in the chain we had set, we were beset by a number of things hindering our travel. The snow and weather the least among them. Animals and beasts roaming the area had gotten increasingly cumbersome to get through, and it only got worse as the days went on. Coyotes and felines were the more opportunistic predators. They only attacked smaller groups, but others who were more aggressive tried to attack the main caravan. Wolves and bears being the worst of them. Wolves roamed in large packs, and they didn't fear our numbers as much as the more solo predators, while bears just didn't care. They took our intrusion into their territory personally, and it didn't matter how many people were with us. They only ran off if there was a person of sufficient strength to bully them off. Otherwise, they would fight against the numbers even if they faced certain defeat. Wolves, on the other hand, were just plain annoying. They circled and looked for weaknesses, attacked when they felt an opening, and hit softer parts in the caravan where the levels were lower or there were fewer people. They were smarter, which was the worst kind of foe. The pack stalking us now was the largest yet, and it seemed they ranged in the area of the lake we were approaching. They didn't take our presence in their hunting grounds lightly. Over 100 of them were out and about, circling us and getting a reading. The alpha had yet to make its presence known, but it was only a matter of time before they attacked. A day or two at most before they found their opportunity. As we stopped for the night and began to set up camp, nerves began to fray. The constant of being on edge wore on people, and it only worsened as the sun descended and the darkness set in. Extra precaution was taken when setting up camp, extra defenses and a few extra traps were laid just in case of attack, but its reassurance was little to the people on watch. My patience was quickly wearing out. "I'm sick of this. I will not sit here and wait for them to attack," I said, voicing my frustration and making for my hammer. "We've been over this, Chris. If you go out and kill everything, the guards won't get the experience they need." Abigail said not for the first time. Some of the caravan who were more violence-inclined had taken up the guard position and had taken to it well. They stood watch at night, patrolled around the caravan on horses while we moved, and did much the same as a caravan guard would. I had spoken to a few to feel out if they liked the position and if they would be willing to be city guards once we stopped. But it was still too soon for most. They filled the role out of necessity rather than desire. Some did have the protection bone, as you could say, similar to Jonathan, and I felt a city guard role would suit them, but I had yet to approach most, opting to wait and observe for longer before asking them. While Austin, Hal, Rachel, and I could take care of most of the things we had come across during our journey, we refrained from doing so. It was in an effort to train people and for them to be self-reliant, rather than dependent on us. We let them handle the odd beast or monster and only helped when there was a real threat they would face. Training was fine, but deaths were not. We kept that approach for most of the trip, only stepping in when needed, and I had mostly gotten used to it. Letting others fight for me was still grating to sit through, but this was different. The wolves were a real threat, more than I thought they could handle. Nearly the entire pack that had been identified were well above ear rank, and speculation ran wild. Some said all were ear rank and the alpha was nearing level 100. The outlandish tales only got worse as the anticipation rose. Even when it was nearly impossible for some of it to be true, people's minds took things far when the wolves acted like ghosts in the night, circling only when it got dark and waiting us out. A pressure that I hadn't known I missed was back, and I did not like having to sit and wait. The pressure of a challenge. Wherever the alpha was, I knew it was strong. Gabriel knew more, but I had a sense of my own. One built through waves of battle, and it knew what was out there qualified. That it was a worthy foe. It was usually at this point that I would sigh and sit back down, agreeing with her that the guards needed this rather than me doing everything for them. But not this time. This was different. I tire of this, the guards will have other chances to gain experience. Depriving them of this one won't do much, I said as I continued gearing up. My armor was never far from hand and my hammer stayed with me. It was second nature at this point to prepare for battle. Abigail didn't try to stop me a second time. She knew I wouldn't be deterred, so she shifted her focus. "At least take Austin and John with you. There are a lot of them out there." I would have thought she knew me better by now. "No, I will handle it alone." She didn't get to say more before I was striding out of camp, toward where I felt the challenge lay. Elliot. Point of view. His time since the return had been quite lackluster. He thought gaining magical powers would make his life more interesting, but the mundane seemed to follow him. Sure, he could now conjure metal out of thin air and morph it into any shape he desired, but the last few months felt too normal to him compared to the insanity he had expected. The orderly traveling of caravan life hadn't been the excitement he had thought he would return to. When the tutorial started, he didn't despair or fight against it like he had seen others. He had welcomed it. While he didn't live the best life before, it was sure to be exciting now, right? Except the thrilling escapades of fighting for his life and saving the world were nowhere to be seen. He was only living through the motions as he had done previously. Only this time with a touch of magic flair thrown in. Novels and games had lied to him. Perfect storylines specifically curated for one person to be the center of the universe were false. Who knew? Still, he had expected more than this. Canada had been his home long before the system changed it, and he loved the small town he grew up in, only for it to be demolished upon his return. He didn't know what to do after that, but the town came together, and there was a genuine sense of camaraderie, one he hadn't felt before. Some tried to rebuild, but someone in town had knowledge of what they called pylons, and without it, they wouldn't be able to rebuild. They had gotten by in the beginning, but it only got harder. The threats increased and they began to lose people. Arguments started about what to do after that. Some left, braving the wilds over staying put. He was about to do the same before a new group of people arrived. They came with horses and wagons, seeking to find a place to settle. It was a perfect compromise. He got to stay near his home, and they had the pylon required to create what they were missing. All of his town that stayed agreed and joined up with the caravan headed north. There wasn't a reason not to. Their town was in ruins, and it held little else besides sentimental value. Hearing they were going further north caused some hesitation, but it wasn't that hard to work through. They were used to the cold. A little more wouldn't hurt, especially with their newfound strength and resilience. After joining, they mingled and integrated with the group and heard more of their story. Finding out they had come thousands of miles north all the way from Ohio had been startling. Who would do that? Still, Elliot did what he could. He knew he wasn't the most powerful, but he had the most levels of his town. He was one of the few who came back ear-ank and led his town during the change. After joining, his sense of strength was thoroughly washed away. What little growth of his ego was shattered after learning how many of the caravan were stronger than him. Going from the strongest to not even in the top 20 was a blow to come to grips with. But it was one he had to work through. He killed what he could and trained the best he could. He didn't need to be the strongest, but he refused to be average any longer. He had lived enough of an average life. It was in that vein of thought that he worked as one of the guards. He stood watch and participated in patrols. It let him fight and gain experience rather than only being along for the ride. It was for that reason he now sat up on watch as the wolves howled and shuffled around in the dark, causing him to flinch when one sounded particularly close. Now was one of the few times he regretted his decision. He normally wasn't afraid of the beasts they came across, but these were different. They had power and numbers. He had managed to identify one of the wolves when they came near, and he found out that they were so far above him that all it returned was question marks. He wasn't high enough level to be even given a number. That was when the fear started to creep in. Some of the others had more perception or more powerful skills and were able to get numbers, but that did little to assuage their worries. What they did get were levels in the 60s and 70s. If that was the common level of the pack, what of the strongest? How high was it if that was the common fodder? It's got to be close to level 100. Look how large the pack is. It takes power to keep it all together. Samuel whispered from beside the fire next to him. Samuel was from the same town as him, and they frequently were on watch together. Their skills complemented each other and his new leaders. The people running the caravan didn't see a reason to break them up. No way it's that high. It's only been half a year, and we're barely above level 50. Elliot whispered back. Their speculation didn't end at the pack leader's level. What do you think they will do about it? Samuel said. After learning the strength of the pack, that was the question on most people's minds. Elliot and Samuel had only recently joined, and they had no idea what the people in charge would do about it. Even some of the people who had been with the caravan for longer didn't know. They had said the caravan leader only took action a handful of times, and it had never been more than a light skirmish for him. There were whispers that the man was powerful, but no one knew the extent of it. He had never needed to show everything, and it was highly speculated about. The leader was a bit standoffish. Elliot knew the man's name, but little else besides that. And the fact he used a hammer, that bit was clear, as he always had the hulking thing on him. Christopher, as the man did not like strangers calling him Chris, usually kept to his inner circle. Members of his family or close friends were the only ones he usually spoke to. He talked with others occasionally, but it was little more than small talk. What surprised Elliot was the man knew his name. There were over 200 people in the caravan, and the man knew his name. Well, he knew the names of all of the guards, but the fact he knew was comforting. It was this seldom communication that made Elliot do a double take when he saw the man walking toward him. He walked with a purpose, and his bearing carried him right at Elliot. He traded in his usual furs for thick plated metal armor covering him from head to toe, and his hammer, which was usually strapped to his back, carried in his hands. He looked ready for war, as insane as that thought sounded. It wasn't only the armor and weapon that made Elliot think that, but the expression on his face and the way he walked. A confident gait with a matching hardened face. For a brief second, everything Elliot had done since joining flitted through his head, as if trying to come up with a reason the man was headed toward him with that expression, but it came up with nothing. Elliot couldn't fathom why he was walking toward him, and he sat completely still as the man neared, scared to move a muscle. Something about him made his instincts scream. Elliot wasn't the best fighter, but he had done enough in the tutorial to know when a fight was unwinnable. Everything his instincts were telling him was that if he fought this man, he would lose. Samuel matched his stock-still position, and it was silent as the man approached. Only his footfalls and the crackling of the campfire were audible. He walked to the edge of the campfire and stopped. Where was the nearest sighting? Was all he asked. Nothing besides a direction. Voice firm and clear without hesitation. Not trusting his own voice to preform the same, Elliot pointed off into the distance where he last heard the wolves. Samuel didn't even do anything except stare blankly at the man. Content with that answer, Christopher walked in the direction Elliot had indicated without another word. As his back grew smaller, the dread Elliot felt faded with it. It was the first time he had experienced something like that, and it left his back sweaty and hands shaky. The man could be scary when he wanted to. "You don't think he's going out there alone, do you?" Samuel said after he had recovered. Somehow that thought hadn't occurred to him. What was the man going to do, fight them all alone? That was absurd. End of chapter 160.